Welcome back, sweet dreamer. Tonight on Sleepy Crown, we continue our tranquil journey through ancient Egyptian pharaohs in part 2, beginning with the mighty warrior reign of Ramesses II, the great conqueror who built eternal monuments and fought legendary battles, gently flowing to the groundbreaking era of Hatshepsut, the woman who dared to become king and built architectural wonders, and finally arriving at the tragic but fascinating story of Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh whose golden tomb captivated the world. Before you let sleep take you away, please like this peaceful tale, share a comment about which of these legendary pharaohs fascinates you most, the warrior king, the female pharaoh, or the boy with the golden mask, and subscribe to join our growing family of dreamers. Get comfy under your blanket, let your thoughts slow, and allow the soft echo of temple, chants and desert winds to carry you gently towards sleep. If you enjoy these calming tales, we're always happy to have you here in our cozy circle of history lovers. The pharaoh known by history as Pharaoh Ramesses the Great, known simply as Ramesses in his lifetime, was born in the late 14th century BC. Scholars tend to believe that he was most likely born in the year 1303 BC, but there is no surviving information as to his exact date of birth. His father was a member of a leading aristocratic and military family, which came from the northern part of Egypt, probably from one of the several fortified urban centers of the Nile River Delta. His original name is unclear, but he would later become known as Seti Buaim, as we will see. Ramesses's mother was Tuya, the daughter of a military officer named Raya, and so a member of the Egyptian military nobility herself. Ramesses was born into a world that had been going through one of the first golden ages of ancient times. This was the height of the Bronze Age, and powerful, centralized states had emerged in many parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Greek world was dominated by powers like the Mycenae on the mainland and the Minoans on the Kea island of Crete. And throughout this time, complex literary and artistic societies were beginning to emerge in ways that would shape the ancient world for centuries to come. In what is now Turkey, the powerful Hittite Empire had emerged, centered on the city of Hattusa. Shortly before Ramesses's birth, it had begun conquering parts of the Levant and Mesopotamia, and was effectively Egypt's most significant rival for power in the region. Further to the southeast, a number of significant states existed in Mesopotamia proper and Persia, notably the Babylonian Empire and the Assyrian Empire. Each of these states was wealthy, had complex bureaucracies, and was engaged in extensive trade across this Bronze Age world. For instance, a trader or merchant in a city like Tyre or Sidon in the Levant in the 14th century BC could purchase pottery from Knossos in Crete, olive oil from Athens in Greece, papyrus from Egypt, and textiles from Mesopotamia and Persia, all bought and sold in copper, gold, and silver, mined in places like Western Anatolia under the Hittites' control, or Cyprus, a major center of copper, mining, a necessity in order to make bronze chariots, weapons, and other tools. Egypt itself was no exception to this story of prosperity. This was an era known as the New Kingdom period, one which had begun in the 16th century BC and which would extend beyond Ramesses's own time. The term New Kingdom is a relatively modern creation, having been coined in the 19th century, but it is typically accepted by Egyptologists as accurately describing a distinct period of Bronze Age culture in Egypt, which was more prosperous than anything that had come before it there. Even the Old Kingdom culture of the pharaohs who built the Great Pyramids at Giza a millennium earlier. During this New Kingdom period, the pharaohs developed a powerful government overseen by viziers and many scribes. A large military was also kept at the ready, powered by new technologies such as chariots and weapons made of bronze. With all this in place, the pharaohs were not only able to collect a greater amount of taxes and govern more efficiently at home, but the New Kingdom Empire expanded in all directions, with outposts being established further down the River Nile than ever before into what is now Sudan, but which was then known as Nubia, and a growing amount of territory being acquired on the Sinai Peninsula and northwards into Canaan and Lebanon. This empire had reached a particular peak in the 15th century BC during the long reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III, whose conquests extended the Egyptian kingdom northeast into parts of modern-day Syria and northern Iraq. Little is known about the specifics of Ramesses' own childhood, but the political developments of the time were extremely significant. At the time he was born, Egypt was ruled by Pharaoh Horemheb, a member of the 18th dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs. Horemheb is known for having restored a certain amount of stability to Egypt's domestic politics after a turbulent period, during which a near predecessor, Akhenaten, had attempted to establish a monotheistic cult of the sun, replacing the traditional religious and political structures of Egypt. This caused enormous unrest within Egypt and led to its decline as an international power. Horemheb reversed many of these decisions and calmed the unrest Akhenaten had created along the course of the River Nile, but he appears to have had no surviving sons and no biological successor. As such, he decided to designate the head of his government, the Grand Vizier Paramess, as his successor. Paramess was Ramesses' grandfather, and so the family rose to become the 19th dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs when Paramess became the pharaoh, adopting the royal name Ramesses I around 1292 BC. He ruled for just a few short years before his death, at which time Ramesses' father succeeded him as second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, adopting the name Seti the Firm in honor of Seth, the Egyptian god of war. Ramesses was now the heir to the throne of New Kingdom Egypt, as he was soon appointed as Prince Regent by his father, who would reign for just over a decade. During this time, he began to re-establish Egyptian control over some of the territory which had been held to the northeast in Canaan and Syria, under earlier rulers such as Thutmose III, but which had been lost as a result of the divided state of the kingdom during Akhenaten's reign and religious reforms. Ramesses doubtless accompanied his father in some of his campaigns northeast into the Levant and gained valuable military experience during his time as Prince Regent. He would soon need this experience as he rose to the throne as a relatively young man. He is known to have become pharaoh on the 27th day of the season of the harvest, in a particular year of his father's reign, one which is believed to equal an accession date of 31st May 1279 BC. He would reign for the next 66 years in what is typically counted as the most significant reign of any Egyptian pharaoh, adopting the full royal name Uzamatre Setepenre, meaning roughly, the law or harmony of Ra, the Egyptian sun god, is powerful. I am chosen of Ra. Ramesses' first major act as the new ruler of Egypt was to deal with a threat which had been growing in the northern parts of the kingdom for several years. Even before his accession, sea pirates, known as the Sheridan Sea Pirates, had been raiding the northern coast of the kingdom into the River Nile Delta from the eastern Mediterranean. This was one of the most prosperous and important parts of Ramesses' kingdom, and it was vital that these attacks be stopped. Thus, beginning in the second year of his reign, he began establishing forts along the northern coast of the kingdom and northeastwards towards Sinai and Canaan. New ships were also constructed to patrol the waters of the eastern Mediterranean, and warning posts were set up to signal to larger settlements when raiding parties were making their way towards the Egyptian kingdom. All of this culminated in a major sea battle, in which Ramesses and his navy were victorious. A stone monument commemorating this at Tanis in the northeast of the Nile Delta has survived down to modern times and provides evidence of this victory today, but the exact details of how it occurred or what it involved, other than that Ramesses scored an early victory, remain unclear. Having stabilized the northern shores of Egypt and the Nile Delta, Ramesses' primary aim became to restore Egyptian control over Canaan and other parts of the Levant, as had existed in earlier times. This was a paramount concern. While Egypt itself was a wealthy land based on the abundant agriculture practiced along the shores of the River Nile and the production of pottery and papyrus in cities like Thebes and Memphis, the most wealthy cities in the late Bronze Age world lay in Canaan, cities like Tyre and Sidon, which were at the crossroads of all the major empires and were major trading centers as a result. Consequently, Ramesses was eager to restore Egyptian rule over the region, as had existed 2 centuries earlier in the time of Thutmose III. However, while there was no state with an army sufficient to withstand Egypt within Canaan and the southern reaches of the Levant, the region was also wanted by the Hittite Empire to the north. Much of Ramesses's rule would be concerned with trying to seize control of this region and fight off counterattacks by the Hittites. In the course of doing so, he would fight arguably the most significant battle in the history of the Bronze Age. One of Ramesses's first actions early in his reign was to construct a new capital in the northeastern parts of the Nile Delta in an effort to increase Egyptian power to the northeast into the Levant. The capital of pharaonic Egypt had moved around over the centuries. For instance, in ancient times during the Old Kingdom period, it lay at Memphis near what is now Cairo. However, the capital during the New Kingdom period was typically located well down the River Nile at what was known then as Thebes, but which we call Luxor today. Akhenaten, the controversial pharaoh who a half-century before Ramesses' birth had attempted to establish a monotheistic religion centered on the worship of Aten, had established a new capital at Amarna as a center of the new religion. Thus, there was a substantial precedent for moving the capital of the pharaonic kingdom. Ramesses named his new capital Pi-Ramesses, near what is now the town of Qantir. Ramesses' father, Seti I, had previously had a summer palace in the region, and it seems likely that Ramesses had spent much of his youth here. Now, in the 1270s, he established it as a semi-military capital, with large workshops and factories erected to begin churning out significant quantities of weapons, armor, and chariots. As such, Pi-Ramesses became a kind of administrative capital of Lower Egypt. But as we will see from Ramesses's building program, he never abandoned the belief that Thebes or Luxor was the religious and spiritual capital of Egypt. In the earliest part of his wars against the Hittites, Ramesses faced King Muwatalli II, the ruler of the Hittite Empire since the mid-1290s. Muwatalli had taken advantage of Egyptian weakness early in his reign and moved his capital south from the traditional site at Hatshepsut in what is now central Turkey to Tarhuntusa in the southeast of the Konya Plain. It was indicative of how both rulers saw Canaan, Syria, and the wider Levant as a contested region that they needed to be near, that both Ramesses and Muwatalli moved their capitals to be closer to the Levant. In the earliest years of his reign, Ramesses conducted annual military campaigns northeast from the Nile Delta. The first of these, around 1275 BC, resulted in the pharaoh cementing his control over southern Canaan, before campaigning further north to the region around modern-day Beirut. Here he had a commemorative stone pillar erected at Nahr el-Kalb. The text of this has been destroyed over time, but it almost certainly proclaimed Ramesses's successes in campaigning this far north, a statement of Egypt's claims to control the region. Similarly, he engaged in further campaigns against the Amurru, a people who occupied much of what is now Syria as vassals of King Muwatalli and the Hittites. However, whatever nominal control over this region Ramesses was able to establish in 1275 was short-lived. No sooner had he withdrawn back to Pi-Ramesses at the end of the campaigning season than Egyptian influence in Syria effectively collapsed, and the Hittites were able to reimpose themselves. The war between the Egyptians and the Hittites at this time has become widely renowned for a battle which it is generally accepted occurred in the year 1274 BC. This was the Battle of Kadesh or Kadesh, near the city of Kadesh, on the banks of the Orontes River in western Syria. The Battle of Kadesh was clearly a highly significant one, involving armies of a very substantial size by the standards of the Late Bronze Age, but also being regarded as a unique or significant event by the parties involved. It is, for instance, the best documented military encounter of the second millennium BC, with both sides making extensive records concerning it in years to come in the form of tablets, wall paintings, and inscriptions throughout Egypt and other parts of the Late Bronze Age world. Thus, the Battle of Kadesh was unquestionably believed by contemporaries to have been an era-defining military engagement. The background of the battle was Ramesses's new campaign into Syria in 1274 BC. As with the previous year's campaign, his goal was to extend Egyptian power further north into Syria at the expense of the Hittites. Ramesses led 4 divisions of troops into Canaan and then north towards Syria that year. These were named for some of the paramount Egyptian deities, Amun, Ra, Seth, and Ptah, and consisted of perhaps as many as 40,000 men, with 2,000 chariots, also provided for the campaign. These were augmented by thousands of Canaanite mercenaries who joined the pharaoh's forces. However, not all of these forces were deployed at Kadesh, and it seems probable that Ramesses' forces did not exceed 30,000 men in total on the field of battle. Arrayed against him was Muwatalli's army of somewhere between 25,000 and 45,000 men, with several thousand chariots also brought south into Syria. Consequently, the armies of the two sides were relatively evenly matched. A striking aspect of the engagement was the number of chariots deployed, with many Egyptologists and Hittite scholars speculating since that this was the largest chariot battle in history. In its initial stages, Ramesses was caught off guard at Kadesh. He received false intelligence about the location of the main Hittite army, far to the north, whereas, in fact, Muwatalli's armies were stationed near Old Kadesh, not far from the Egyptian advance party. As a result, when the Hittites attacked, some of Ramesses' main divisions of troops were far to the south and could not be brought into the field of battle. As a result, the Ra division was scattered by a Hittite chariot assault in the first stages of the battle near Kadesh. However, this is the point at which Ramesses' leadership is believed to have proved pivotal, as he rallied the Ammon division of his troops and counterattacked against the Hittites, breaking their chariot assault. Some accounts have it that the fault also lay with the Hittites, who, believing that their initial attack had proved conclusive, had stopped to plunder the baggage trains and goods of the Ra division, leaving them exposed to Ramesses' coordinated counterattack. Thereafter, Muwatalli ordered his troops to retreat towards the Orontes River. Later Egyptian accounts suggest that the Ptah division now arrived at Kadesh and harassed the Hittites. Muwatalli ordered a new counterattack led by his chariot divisions, but this was unable to break the Egyptian advance. Eventually, the Hittites were forced to flee northwards over the river Orontes, in many cases throwing their weapons and armor aside in order to swim through the river to safety. It is unclear exactly how conclusive the alleged Egyptian victory at Kadesh was. Some Egyptologists believe that the battle was a major military victory for Ramesses. He certainly depicted it as such. For the rest of his long reign, the pharaoh consistently erected stone monuments and had inscriptions and wall paintings placed in temples and in his palaces depicting Kadesh as a great victory for Egypt in Syria. These include the Kadesh inscriptions or bulletin and the poem of Pentor, a prose account of the Egyptian victory which is repeated on the walls of temples all along the course of the river Nile. The poem is found in 8 different places, while the bulletin is to be found inscribed in 7 different locations around Egypt. Consequently, it is clearly something which Ramesses tried to establish as the official version of his alleged victory at Kadesh. But other scholars of the late Bronze Age world are more skeptical, with some arguing that Kadesh was probably more of a draw than a victory for either side. Certainly it cannot have been the kind of comprehensive victory which Ramesses attempted to depict it as, for the battle did not lead to any major shift in the strategic situation in Syria. Rather, the Egyptians and the Hittites continued to contest the region for many years to come. The Battle of Kadesh did not bring the war between Egypt and the Hittite Empire to a complete conclusion, though it did signal the end of the most intense initial period of clashes between the Egyptians and the Hittites. Skirmishes continued for years thereafter. For instance, in 1269 BC, Ramesses launched a new campaign into Syria, during which he conquered the city of Dapur. However, the pattern during the 1260s was that Ramesses was able to briefly acquire control over parts of Syria while he campaigned personally there, but longer-term control over the region could not be maintained once the major Egyptian military presence was withdrawn. In recognition of this situation, around 1259 BC, the Egyptians and the Hittites agreed to what is variously called either the Egyptian-Hittite Treaty, the Eternal Treaty, or the Silver Treaty. This was signed between Ramesses II and Hattusili III, who had succeeded as ruler of the Hittite Empire at some point in the 1260s. The Eternal Treaty effectively brokered a lasting peace, one in which the two powers agreed to cease hostilities, as it was costing both governments enormous amounts of money and achieving little for either. Thus, Syria was to become a sphere of Hittite influence, with Egypt largely confirmed in its control of Canaan and other more southerly parts of the Levant. Bonds were agreed, pledges made, and the gods invoked as overseers of the eternal peace. The Eternal Treaty is one of the most famed international agreements made in ancient times. This is owing to the highly unusual survival of multiple copies of the text over 3 millennia later in different languages. Copies of the text of the treaty in Egyptian hieroglyphics were found inscribed in 2 separate locations in Luxor in Central Egypt in the first half of the 19th century. Then, in the first years of the 20th century, the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler uncovered a copy of the text in the Akkadian language, the lingua franca of the Hittite Empire and other states of the Middle East in the 13th century BC, as part of a cache of approximately 10,000 tablets which were discovered while excavating the ancient Hittite capital at Hattusa in Turkey. Thus, we have a remarkable example here of an international treaty being copied out and deposited in royal archives and temples in cities 2,000 kilometers away from each other over 3,200 years ago. As to the motives of the respective parties, it is clear that both Ramesses and Hattusili had both come to believe that peace and the fostering of trade in the Levant would be more beneficial than a continuation of their rivalry, while both states were quite likely wary of the rise of the Assyrian Empire to the east in Mesopotamia, and believed a united front against this upstart power was better than ongoing warfare in Syria. The signing of the Eternal Treaty also provided a respite for Ramesses in order for him to concentrate militarily on matters to the south of Egypt. For roughly a millennium, between the middle of the 3rd millennium BC down to roughly 1500 BC, the region of modern-day Sudan had been independent of Egypt. At the time, it was known as Nubia, and was dominated by the Kerma culture, which produced states like the Kingdom of Kush. However, during the New Kingdom period, and in particular during the reign of Thutmose III, Nubia had gradually been brought more and more under the control of pharaonic Egypt. As with Canaan and Syria, Egyptian control declined here as a result of the unrest created by Akhenaten's rule in the 14th century BC. But Ramesses was now in a position to reverse this situation. Early in his reign, he had already campaigned south of the first cataract of the Nile. These cataracts are a series of locations along the course of the river Nile, where the whitewater rapids predominate and were used at the time as intermediary points where Egyptian arms were extended as far as was possible in campaigns against the Nubians. By the 1260s, Ramesses had effectively extended Egyptian control as far as the Second Cataract, which lies south of Abu Simbel and Wadi Halfa in what is now northern Sudan. But the period following the establishment of the Eternal Treaty with the Hittites provided a military respite, which allowed Ramesses to send forces further south again to the Third Cataract. This lies well into Sudan, at the northern margin of the Dongola River. Here, Ramesses was able to establish a southern military colony at Tombos, as evidenced by the discovery of pharaonic and royal inscriptions here in tombs built at the height of the New Kingdom in the 13th century BC. Thus, by the 1240s BC, Ramesses had effectively brought a significant amount of Nubia under outright Egyptian control. Ramesses was soon campaigning westward as well. Our knowledge of Libya in ancient times is surprisingly limited for a region that was in close proximity to major centers of civilization such as Egypt and Crete. Generally speaking, the main settlement points here were a series of ports and oases along the north coast or slightly inland, but close to the Mediterranean Sea. The land here was known as Tchehenu to the Egyptians. Libya is a name derived from later Greek descriptions of the region. Despite the lack of historical knowledge about the society that existed here in ancient times, there was significant contact between the Egyptians and Libya throughout the New Kingdom period, mostly in the form of Berber raids into the western branches of the Nile Delta and Egyptian efforts to establish coastal colonies along the north of Libya. Ramesses attempted to further this effort by establishing new forts along the Mediterranean coastline and reinforcing a fort at Zawiyat el Rakam, which his father, Seti I, had established earlier after campaigning against the Libyan tribes of the region. In the course of Ramesses's reign, this became the major western extremity of the Egyptian kingdom, though trade centers and vassal states were to be found further to the west in Libya proper. These accomplishments, as with nearly everything else to do with Ramesses's military endeavors, were recorded in a series of stone monuments and other monumental inscriptions in southern and central Egypt later in his reign. With these campaigns in Nubia and Libya, and the earlier endeavors in Canaan and Syria, by the middle of his reign, Ramesses had succeeded in extending the Egyptian kingdom to the greatest point it had been at since the days of Thutmose III 2 centuries earlier. Beyond the pharaoh's core control of Egypt, his forces had moved south along the River Nile, effectively repossessing Nubia after it had broadly regained its independence during the period of instability under Akhenaten in the 14th century BC. Elsewhere, Ramesses had campaigned westward into the deserts of the Sahara and along the north coast to bring Libya into a partial vassalage. However, it was his conquests to the northeast that were most substantial. Here, Ramesses had captured Canaan and much of Syria. It wasn't simply that this was one of the richest parts of the world at the time, with affluent trading cities like Tyre and Sidon, but in order to achieve some hegemony here, Ramesses had to defeat one of the most substantial powers of the ancient world, the Hittite Empire. In doing so, he carved out one of the largest territorial empires ever seen up to that time. Thus, in the late Bronze Age, Ramesses had arguably transformed New Kingdom Egypt into the most powerful state in the known world, a major achievement after the period of instability that had characterized Egypt as recently as the 14th century. Throughout his military campaigns of the 1270s, 1260s, and 1250s, Ramesses was accompanied by an ever-growing number of his sons. This is unsurprising when we consider that Ramesses is believed to have had approximately 100 children, of which a roughly equal amount were sons and daughters. Such a large brood was a byproduct of the practice of polygamy by ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Ramesses had many wives, the details of several of which are well known. For instance, his primary consort was Nefertari, the first of Ramesses's great royal wives. Her background is not precisely known, but some have speculated that she was descended from Pharaoh I, who had ruled Egypt 4 decades prior to Ramesses's accession as part of the 18th dynasty. She and Ramesses evidently married quite young, as she became queen consort as soon as he ascended to the throne around 1279 BC. They had many children together, and on the strength of the numerous temples and shrines which Ramesses had built in her honor, there is no doubting that she was the most revered of his wives. She is also somewhat unique as a queen consort of the New Kingdom period, for whom we have surviving correspondence. Nefertari wrote on multiple occasions to King Hattusili III, ruler of the Hittite Empire, and his wife, Puduhepa, in the 1260s and 1250s, and tablets of this correspondence have been unearthed in the Hittite capital Hattusa. Nefertari died around 1255, and since Ramesses lived for many decades to come, new great wives emerged in the years that followed. Paramount amongst these was Isetnofret. She too seems to have married Ramesses before his accession as pharaoh, but she was clearly a junior consort while Nefertari lived. Her seniority from the mid-1250s is attested to by numerous inscriptions and records of her, which appear on statues and temple walls across Egypt. Other great wives of the pharaoh emerged from political arrangements. For instance, as part of the Eternal Treaty of 1259 BC with the Hittites, Ramesses took one of the daughters of King Hattusili III and Queen Puduhepa as his wife, although the marriage to Mathorna-Ferrer was not solemnized until the mid-1240s BC, presumably as the Hittite king's daughter was considered to be too young for the marriage to be formalized in the early 1250s BC. Curiously enough, some of Ramesses's other great royal wives included some of his daughters. Bint Anath, for instance, was born from Ramesses's marriage to Isetnofret, before later marrying her own father. Such familial relationships were common throughout the history of pharaonic Egypt and resulted in significant complications of inbreeding, the most famous example of which had been Tutankhamun 50 years before Ramesses' reign. Tutankhamun suffered from multiple physical ailments, the exact nature of which is still debated, but which Egyptologists agree were most likely owing to the species of inbreeding that characterized Ramesses II's own familial life in the 13th century BC. This extensive royal family was intimately connected throughout Ramesses' long reign with the cult of Ra, the sun god, and one of the paramount deities in the Egyptian religious system, who was also worshipped as Amun-Ra in a slightly different form. Ra, along with others such as Ptah and Horus, were the paramount deities of the New Kingdom, and, as we will see shortly, Ramesses' extensive building program across Egypt from the 1260s onwards made continuous efforts to associate the pharaoh with the cult of these particular deities. From the early 1240s BC onwards, once Ramesses had reigned for over 30 years, he was also able to become the center of his own species of religious cult in the shape of the Sed festival, or Feast of the Tail. This was a religious festival that was held annually to celebrate the reign of any pharaoh who had ruled for over 30 years. It was nominally held in honor of the wolf god, Sed, or Wepwawet. The origins of the festival are somewhat macabre. It may have been the case that the Sed festival was originally held as a ritual in which a long-lived pharaoh was ritually murdered, the idea being that once he reached a certain age, it was time for him to be removed from power. Over time, the festival changed to one in which the king was honored rather than killed. Under Ramesses, the Sed festival was celebrated at the traditional capital, Thebes, for the first time in 1249 BC. Thereafter, it was held every 3 years, for as long as Ramesses lived. Such was the length of his reign that he went on to celebrate an unprecedented number of Sed festivals. If the first half of Ramesses' reign was primarily dominated by warfare and the extension of the realm's borders, the second half of it was remarkable for the extensive building projects that were undertaken by the pharaoh. Ancient Egypt is synonymous with brilliant architectural achievement, but this was achieved at irregular intervals. For instance, the first intermediate period of Egyptian history, which occurred in the late 3rd millennium BC, prior to the advent of the subsequent Middle Kingdom, was a period of lackluster building projects. Conversely, the New Kingdom period, which had begun in the 16th century BC, saw a new age of major building projects commissioned by the pharaohs along the river Nile. Ramesses II was the greatest proponent of this new age of pharaonic patronage, of religious and mortuary architecture. In fact, his reign witnessed the most significant building programs seen since the days of pharaohs such as Cheops, who in the 26th century BC constructed the pyramid complex at Giza near modern-day Cairo, including the Great Pyramids, the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. However, by the New Kingdom period, such monumental buildings as were constructed by Ramesses focused more on erecting great temples, obelisks, and statues to honor the pharaoh and the gods, rather than on giant pyramids to act as mortuary tombs. One of the most significant building projects undertaken by Ramesses was at Thebes or Luxor in central Egypt, the traditional capital of New Kingdom Egypt. Here, Ramesses had the Ramesseum built on the Theban necropolis, an elevated region on the west bank of the River Nile in the city, where many other pharaohs had erected mortuary and religious buildings over the centuries. The Ramesseum took roughly 20 years to complete and is effectively a temple with several courtyards surrounding it. Large stone pylons and gateways lead from courtyard to courtyard, with a gigantic statue of Ramesses towering over the inner court. The temple itself consisted of 3 rooms, with columns and terracotta-style cells dividing up the sanctuary. Throughout them stand many statues of the Egyptian gods and goddesses, while several colossal statues of Ramesses once adorned the temple. Unfortunately, several of these were removed from Thebes in the 19th century and are now found in places in Europe, such as the British Museum. On what remains, reliefs commemorate Ramesses' victory at Kadesh and other accomplishments both inside and outside the temple. What is particularly interesting about the Ramesseum is that there is evidence that a scribal school was also established here, while a small royal palace stood next to the courtyard, indicating that this was a site with several other uses beyond its religious functions. It clearly served as a center of pharaonic government in Thebes, when Ramesses based himself out of the traditional New Kingdom capital. Ramesses also ordered some construction work at Saqqara. This is a site not far from the Great Pyramids of Giza, and where the first major pyramid ever built in ancient Egypt, that of Pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty, was constructed in the 27th century BC. Saqqara remained a major center of monumental building work over the centuries. Ramesses decided to make his own contributions to the complexes here, in association with one of his eldest sons, Prince Khamweset. For instance, the pair had the pyramid of Unas, a pharaoh of the 5th dynasty who had lived in the 24th century BC, repaired and added an inscription to the southern facade of the edifice to indicate that they had overseen this restoration work. Ramesses and his son also enlarged the temple of Serapis, or Serapeum, at Saqqara, a major center of the cult of Apis, the bull god of Egyptian mythology, who was believed to be the physical manifestation of Ptah, the Egyptian god of crafts, merchants, and the dead. Recent archaeological discoveries at Saqqara have also unearthed the tomb of Ptah-Mwaya, who served for a time as Grand Vizier and treasurer in the government of Ramesses II. His was not the only tomb built at Saqqara for senior government officials of Ramesses's reign, and the site at Saqqara highlights the esteem such bureaucrats were held in at the height of the New Kingdom in ancient Egypt. One of the most significant aspects of Ramesses's building program was the manner in which he used grand temples and buildings as a way of expressing the extension of Egyptian power into regions that had largely become independent of pharaonic rule in the 14th century BC. This was particularly the case to the south towards Nubia, along the course of the river Nile. Ramesses had many temples constructed here on the way to what is now Sudan, as an expression of the rejuvenation of Egyptian rule in this area. One of the most impressive was the Temple of Beit el-Wali, which was built on an island in the middle of the river Nile, just a few kilometers from Aswan in southern Egypt. This was dedicated to some of the foremost Egyptian deities of the New Kingdom period: Amun-Ra, Re-Horakti, Khnum, and Anuket. It is notable for having some of the best preserved and most impressive wall painting reliefs from ancient Egypt, many of which depict Ramesses' campaigns into Nubia and his subjugation of the region. His campaigns into Syria and Libya are also depicted. Over 100 kilometers to the south, on the west bank of the river Nile, Ramesses had the two temples of Wadi Asebwa also constructed, renovating one earlier temple in the process. The site here was used as a stop-off point for boats traversing the Nile to and from Nubia. Ramesses thus had the temples constructed in a location where many people visited and dedicated them both to himself and Amun-Ra. Perhaps the most striking architectural feature here is the rows of sphinxes which depicted Ramesses as individuals entered and left the temples. Perhaps the greatest building project undertaken by Ramesses, though, lay far to the south of Luxor, near what is now the border between Egypt and Sudan at the Second Nile Cataract. This was the temple complex near what was then known as Ipsambul, but which we know today as Abu Simbel. Here, Ramesses had initiated the construction of two temples back in the mid-1260s. They would take 20 years to complete, but eventually resulted in two large temples carved into a sheer rock face near the village. One of these was dedicated to Ramesses himself, and the smaller one was in honor of the pharaoh's primary consort, Queen Nefertari. When it was completed in 1244 BC, the Great Temple was inscribed as having been built as, quote, the Temple of Ramesses, beloved of Amun. It consisted of a grand entrance which led into a temple dedicated to several of the major Egyptian deities. Sculptures and reliefs adorned the interior. It is also believed that the temple was built in such a way that the chamber flooded with sunlight on the 22nd of October and the 22nd of February every year, illuminating the statues inside. It is speculated that these dates are significant as possibly being the dates of Ramesses's birth and coronation as pharaoh. Moreover, the reliefs and sculptures are celebratory of Ramesses's reign. with his military campaigns and his victories depicted on the walls, notably the Battle of Kadesh. While the interior of the Temple of Abu Simbel is impressive, the most notable aspect of the temple complex is the series of colossal statues, which were erected on either side of the main entrance. Outside the temple, at the Grand Temple, there are 4 such colossal statues, 2 to either side of the entrance. All 4 of these depict Ramesses and stand approximately 20 meters tall, making them some of the largest pharaonic statues ever carved during the 3 millennia of ancient Egyptian history. It is difficult to get a precise idea of how vast these statues are from looking at photographs, but if one stands next to them, an individual only reaches up to the pharaoh's feet, with the remainder of the statues towering well above. On each statue, Ramesses is depicted wearing the dual crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, a statement here in the border region between Egypt and Nubia, that the pharaoh was lord of the land of the river Nile both to the south and the north. Thus, the Temple of Abu Simbel was meant as a statement of Ramesses' power and rule over Egypt, a proclamation of sorts to those south of Abu Simbel that the pharaohs reigned here yet again. Abu Simbel is the pinnacle of Ramesses' building. Ramesses' reign is notable for its length. Having most likely succeeded his father in 1279 BC, he is believed to have ruled for over 65 years. However, what is somewhat unusual about this long reign is how unremarkable the second half of it was, and in particular the last 2 decades or so of Ramesses' reign. All of the notable events of his time as pharaoh, from the Battle of Kadesh to the Eternal Treaty and the campaigns west to Libya and south into Nubia, all occurred in the first 20 or so years of his rule. Even the monumental building programs which he undertook at Abu Simbel, Thebes and elsewhere, although many of them took upwards of 20 years to complete, were generally finished by the early 1230s BC. By way of comparison, the last 20 or so years of Ramesses II's reign are something of a mystery. There is little evidence of major events or what he may have been doing. This is quite possibly because the pharaoh spent many years ill towards the end of his life, with his health declining. Scientific analysis of his mummy in recent times has revealed that Ramesses suffered from a range of ailments in old age, including arthritis, atherosclerosis, and severe dental issues. But he survived for an immense amount of time despite these illnesses. Such evidence as we have indicates Ramesses II did not die until 1213 BC, in the 66th year of his reign, probably aged around 90, an extraordinarily long life by the standards of the time. He was originally interred in the Valley of the Kings, where many pharaohs were interred in the hills outside Thebes. But owing to looting of the graves here, his body was moved on several occasions. Like all the ancient pharaohs, he was mummified, meaning that his body was partially preserved across the centuries. Ramesses was succeeded by his son, Merneptah, who took the royal name Ba-en-Re Merinetjeru, which means the soul of Ra, beloved of the gods. This Merneptah is believed to have been the 13th son of Ramesses, a development which should have placed him well down the pecking order of possible successors to his father. However, Ramesses had lived for so long that a huge number of his older sons had died. Indeed, Merneptah was probably well into his 60s by the time of his own accession, and his reign would only last 10 years. The most significant development during his reign was a victory which he won over the tribes of Libya at the Battle of Perea in 1208 BC. Thereafter, there was a quick succession of pharaohs before the 19th dynasty came to an end, with the dying out of Ramesses' direct line of descent in 1189 BC. Thus, the dynasty lasted for just over a century and was completely dominated by the reign of Ramesses II. However, in recognition of the extraordinary reign of Ramesses the Great, many pharaohs of the 20th dynasty adopted his royal name. In all, there were eventually 11 Ramesses, the last being Ramesses XV of the 20th dynasty, who died around 1077 BC. In death, Ramesses II has acquired an even greater historical fame over the years, as it has been regularly speculated that he is the pharaoh of the story of the Book of Exodus in the Old Testament. This is one of the earliest sections of the Old Testament, and is central to both Judaism and Christianity. In it, the story of the Jews, who are effectively living as slaves, in what is termed the land of Goshen, but which is pharaonic Egypt, is related. This picks up from the book of Genesis, which had related how Joseph, the son of the Hebrew prophet Jacob, had been tricked by his brothers and sold into slavery in Egypt. Over the next several generations, a large community of Jewish slaves came to live in Egypt under the subjugation of the Egyptian pharaohs. In Exodus, we read the story of how the Jewish prophet Moses is placed in a reed basket and sent down the river Nile by his mother, Jochebed, after the pharaoh had ordered the murder of Jewish children following concern about the number of Jews, or Israelites, that were then present in Egypt. Moses is subsequently found and adopted into the pharaoh's household, where he gains the affection of the Egyptian king. But Moses clashes with the pharaoh's biological son. Eventually, he realizes he is one of the Israelites and leads his people out of Egypt by parting the Red Sea, as the pharaoh's forces attempt to chase him. The debate on Ramesses is whether he could be identified as being either the ruling pharaoh of the Book of Exodus or his biological son, who becomes Moses' rival. There is really no substantive case, however, in either instance for speculating to this effect. The Book of Exodus makes no effort to identify the historical figures who might have been involved in pharaonic Egypt at the time, and the historicity of the events of the Old Testament is, of course, open to speculation as well. Consequently, different writers have speculated that a wide range of pharaohs dating from as early as the 17th century BC and as late as the 12th century BC may be the pharaoh of the Book of Exodus or his biological son. An unusually high proportion of people have been anxious to suggest it was Ramesses II who was the pharaoh at the time, with this line being favored in more than one prominent Hollywood treatment of Moses' life, notably the Ten Commandments of 1956, in which Ramesses was depicted by Yul Brynner. These depictions are largely due to Ramesses being the most prominent pharaoh of this age. His reign was lengthy, and he was involved in military conquests in the Levant, which would fit with the oppression of the Israelites. These things aside, though, there is no historical basis for suggesting that Ramesses II is the pharaoh of the Book of Exodus. Indeed, that Ramesses should be identified with the biblical pharaoh of Exodus is perhaps fitting. After all, much of the tale of Moses portends doom for Egypt for impeding the destiny of the Israelites to return to their ancestral homeland and establish a new kingdom there. And there is no doubting that New Kingdom Egypt quickly headed towards a period of immense decline shortly after Ramesses' reign. Beginning around 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and adjoining areas were struck by a series of attacks by a mysterious confederation of warlike people who have typically been identified as the Sea Peoples. There is no consensus even today as to who these people were or where they had come from, although it has plausibly been speculated that they came eastwards from the western Mediterranean, possibly from Italy and parts of southern France or the northwestern Balkans. Wherever they came from, what we do know is that the onslaught of these newcomers, along with the arrival of other warlike peoples such as the Dorians who came from northern Greece around this time, was an immediate threat to the late Bronze Age world and began to destabilize societies such as those of New Kingdom Egypt in the decades that followed. What followed is typically referred to as the Late Bronze Age collapse in the historiography of the ancient world, as the powerful states which had dominated the region for several centuries either declined dramatically or collapsed. The Hittite Empire splintered into several smaller states during the course of the 12th century BC, while Bronze Age Mycenae and the Minoan civilization of Crete were almost entirely destroyed. New Kingdom Egypt also entered a period of pronounced decline, though it survived as a substantial polity, albeit much weakened internally, divided by civil wars and reduced in terms of its territorial expanse. This reflected much of what occurred elsewhere. Trade collapsed across the Bronze Age world for the space of 2 centuries or more, and the economy was so impacted that whole cities were abandoned and famines struck many regions, such that many historians of the ancient past refer to this as being a dark age of the ancient world, similar to what followed the collapse of the Roman Empire nearly 2 millennia later, what is known as the Third Intermediate period of Egyptian history followed the end of the New Kingdom, as new regional powers began to dominate what remained of pharaonic Egypt, some of them hailing from Nubia in the south. Ramesses II's tomb was discovered during the late 19th century. This was a time when Egyptology, the study of pharaonic Egypt, was entering its first golden age, following the deciphering of Egyptian hieroglyphics using the Rosetta Stone. The great pharaoh's tomb was discovered at Deir el-Bahari in 1881 near Thebes within a wider cache of royal tombs dating to the New Kingdom period. Ramesses' tomb, like nearly all other pharaohs, had been looted at some stage in the past, and revealed nothing to rival the riches of that of Tutankhamun, which would be discovered 40 years later by Howard Carter. However, Ramesses' tomb is nevertheless significant, particularly a series of inscriptions on the sarcophagus, which listed Ramesses' various names and titles, and also provided an inventory of his burial goods. The inscriptions also indicate that Ramesses was not immediately interred at Deir el-Bahari, but rather he was first laid to rest in the tomb of his father, Seti III. It remained there for the next 80 years until such time in the mid-12th century that his tomb was relocated. What is especially strange about all of this is that Egyptologists now believe that the wooden and painted death mask and sarcophagus used in Ramesses' new tomb were actually recycled from the tomb of one of his near successors, Horemheb, the last ruler of the 18th dynasty. It is also evident that renovations were carried out on Ramesses' tomb in subsequent years, indicating that the ancient Egyptians did not simply seal the tombs of dead pharaohs for all time when they were laid to rest, but viewed some of these tombs as shrines which were to be maintained and improved where possible. Unsurprisingly, given the extent of the building program he oversaw, Ramesses II has continued to feature regularly in studies of ancient Egypt and new archaeological projects. Indeed, in the case of Abu Simbel, his temple here was central to one of the most extraordinary relocation projects ever undertaken. In the 1950s, the new government of General Abdel Nasser, who had seized power in Egypt following the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, determined to build a vast new dam at Aswan in order to henceforth control the annual flooding or inundation of the River Nile, on which so much of the country's agriculture depended. The resulting flooding and the creation of what was to be named Lake Nasser near the dam would have submerged Abu Simbel. Accordingly, in 1959, the Egyptian government applied to UNESCO to move the temple. This petition was granted, and over the next several years, several Swedish engineering firms undertook the project for the Egyptian government. The work involved was highly complex, as Abu Simbel was not constructed out of blocks of stone, but was carved into a cliff face. Thus, the temple was rescued by effectively making a giant incision into the mountainside, and then transplanting the temple piece by piece to a site several hundred meters inland and much higher above ground. Thus, Abu Simbel now overlooks the River Nile much as it has for over 3 millennia, but from a different vantage point and site. Owing to the length of his reign and its significance, Ramesses has also featured extensively in modern popular culture. For instance, Norman Mailer's Ancient Evenings, published in 1983 by the American author, was an enormous fictional account of pharaonic Egypt set on one evening in the late 12th century BC, but in which the characters repeatedly discuss the reign of Ramesses II. The Battle of Kadesh is a major feature of the work. Ramesses was also the subject of works by the noted historical fiction writer Christian Jacques, while he is the central character too of Anne Rice's The Mummy. So too does he appear in many Hollywood treatments of ancient Egypt. But surely, the most notable popular cultural reference to the victor of the Battle of Kadesh appeared 2 centuries ago in the Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ozymandias, the Greek name for Ramesses. Here, Shelley used Ramesses as an example of how all great rulers are destined for decline or death. It was meant to be a reflection by Shelley primarily on Napoleon Bonaparte, who had fallen from power in France and Europe just a few years before. Shelley's time of writing, but Shelley used Ramesses as his analogy as news was circulating around London at the time that the British Museum had just acquired one of the colossal heads of the pharaoh from the Ramesseum. Shelley's repetition of the inscription which once adorned the tomb My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, must rank as amongst some of the most famous lines of 19th century poetry. Ramesses II, or Ramesses the Great, was arguably the greatest of all ancient Egypt's pharaohs, of which there were over 170 across 3 millennia. His reign is notable for many things. From a political and military perspective, he extended the Egyptian kingdom to the greatest point it had seen since the reign of Thutmose III, 2 centuries earlier, the point at which Egypt reached its greatest extremity by conquering much of the Levant, Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia. Ramesses did this primarily by defeating the Hittites in his nation's ongoing struggle with them for hegemony over the rich coastal cities of Canaan and Syria, such as Tyre and Sidon. The peak of his success in this respect was victory at the Battle of Kadesh and the Eternal Treaty of 1259 BC. But it was not just here where Ramesses was militarily successful. He also campaigned against the Serene sea pirates early on in his reign, which had been plaguing the northern coast of Egypt for many years prior to his accession, and later campaigned westwards along the Mediterranean coast towards Libya. Finally, to the south, he extended the Egyptian kingdom's influence much further down the course of the river Nile into what is now Sudan, but which was then known as Nubia. This new kingdom empire of Ramesses II was one of the most formidable empires of ancient times. However, there is also the distinct possibility that Ramesses has been accorded the prominence he has in studies of ancient Egypt and amongst Egyptologists owing to his own self-promotion. Ramesses was one of history's first great propagandists. There was no success he achieved on the battlefield or aspect of his reign that he did not commemorate in stone in such a way that it would be remembered for centuries or even millennia to come. Thus, for instance, we find him setting stone monuments and other markers in the Nile Delta and the Levant to proclaim his victories over the Hittites and the Serene sea pirates to the world and to future generations. But it was his building program in places like Luxor, Saqqara, and above all Abu Simbel, way down the Nile near Aswan, which afforded him his greatest legacy. Here in stone, he proclaimed to all his magnificence as a ruler, his ties to the sun god Ra, and his many military accomplishments. Yet, while these building works may have been acts of propaganda, there is no denying their brilliance. Accordingly, from the perspective of the 21st century, surely Ramesses's greatest accomplishment was in having these magnificent temples, statues and obelisks erected across Egypt nearly 3,500 years ago. What do you think of Ramesses the Great? Was he ancient Egypt's greatest pharaoh? Or is the greatness of his legacy partly due to a shrewd policy of propaganda concerning his building projects, as well as his promotion of his own military victories? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The pharaoh known by history as Hatshepsut was born in ancient Egypt in approximately 1507 BC. Her father was Thutmose III, a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty who ruled mainly from the city of Thebes, which is now in the modern city of Luxor on the River Nile, 500 miles south of the Mediterranean Sea. Thutmose IV was a famous military leader and oversaw the vast expansion of the ancient Egyptian empire eastwards into the Levant and southwards into Nubia, now northern Sudan and southern Egypt. He was likely the son of the previous pharaoh, Amenhotep I, and a secondary wife, but the Egyptians did not create family trees, so identifying blood relations can be difficult. Her mother was Ahmose, the principal wife of Thutmose I, but it is not known who Ahmose's parents were, although it is highly likely that she was born into the royal family. Egyptologists have argued that she was the daughter of Pharaoh Amenhotep I, making her the sister and wife of Thutmose, something that was common within the royal family. However, she was never given the title of king's daughter. Instead, she was referred to as the king's sister, suggesting she was the sister of either Amenhotep or Thutmose. Ahmose and her husband Thutmose. Waim had 2 daughters, the eldest of whom was Hatshepsut, and no surviving sons, which would become a problem for the dynasty. Hatshepsut was only the second historically confirmed woman to rule Egypt with the full titles and power of a pharaoh. She belonged to the 18th dynasty, which ran from 1507 BC to 1458 BC, and she ruled for over 2 decades, from 1478 BC to 1458 BC. Hatshepsut lived over 3,500 years ago, and to put into perspective how long the period of ancient Egyptian history is, Hatshepsut lived over 1,000 years after the building of the pyramids of Giza, and 100 years before Tutankhamun, 200 years before Ramesses, and 1,400 years before the most famous female pharaoh, Cleopatra. Little is known about Hatshepsut's childhood, but her name, which means foremost of noble ladies, highlighted her prominent position within the royal family. She certainly would have had important royal duties to fulfill, including being involved in religious rituals. She was known to worship the cow goddess Hathor in particular, who was the goddess of love, beauty, music, dancing, fertility, and pleasure, and was also the protector of women. There were 42 state gods and goddesses in total in the ancient Egyptian religion, the most important of which was Amun-Ra, the sun god, creator who was later seen as king of the gods. As the eldest daughter of the pharaoh, Hatshepsut would have been expected to marry the next pharaoh, a tradition which aimed to keep the royal bloodline pure, and so, at around the age of 12, she married her half-brother Thutmose II, becoming his principal wife. As Thutmose II was younger than Hatshepsut, she perhaps took over the reins of power in her husband's name when their father, Thutmose III, died in 1493 BC. By the time Hatshepsut came to full power in around 1478 BC, Egypt as a unified country was already 17 centuries old, as legendary King Menes had first ruled a unified Egypt in around 3100 BC. As it is today, the land of ancient Egypt was made habitable by the river Nile, which cut through the desert and gave names to the 2 regions of Egypt: Upper Egypt, which was upriver in the south, and Lower Egypt, downriver in the north, around the Nile Delta region. The king, or pharaoh, ruled both regions, with the title of King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lord of the 2 lands. But there were distinct differences between the 2 areas. They had different protector goddesses: Nekhbet, the vulture goddess, in Upper Egypt, and Wadjet, the cobra goddess in Lower Egypt. The regions were also represented by different symbols: the lotus for the upper and the papyrus for the lower, which were often tied together to symbolize unity. In those periods when Upper and Lower Egypt were united, there was huge prosperity and amazing cultural achievement. They were true golden ages. The first golden age occurred during the period of the Old Kingdom, 2649 BC, 2100 BC. This was the age of the pyramids. Breakup and competing family dynasties brought this golden age to a temporary end, a period called the First Intermediate Period, from 2181 BC to 2055 BC. The Middle Kingdom from 2030 BC to 1650 BC was the Second Golden Age, a time when Egyptian culture and literature flourished. This period of growth had begun with the reunification of Upper and Lower Egypt by Mentuhotep II. However, the beginning of the end of the Middle Kingdom was caused by a break in the royal line. Female pharaoh Sobekneferu died in 1802 BC without any heirs, resulting in the collapse of the successful 12th dynasty. The next 2 dynasties, which overlapped, proved weak. The 13th dynasty was forced to retreat southwards towards Memphis and failed to prevent a breakaway dynasty from forming. The breakaway 14th dynasty reigned separately over the Nile Delta region at the same time. The Second Intermediate Period from 1650 BC to 1550 BC, which followed, saw Egypt once again divided. In the north, the Hyksos dynasty arrived from Western Asia, and its 6 kings ruled as the 15th dynasty. In the south, the Kingdom of Kush, an early civilization in the region of Nubia, northern Sudan, expanded its reach. In the middle sat the Egyptian Kingdom of Thebes, or the 16th dynasty and the 17th dynasty. It was during the 17th dynasty that war was launched against Hyksos rule, who were eventually pushed out of Egypt by the Thebans of the 17th dynasty. It was at this time that Upper and Lower Egypt were reunited by Ahmose I of Thebes in 1550 BC, and the Third Golden Age began. This brought ancient Egypt full circle, as another Theban, Mentuhotep II, had united Upper and Lower Egypt at the start of the Middle Kingdom too, also triggering a golden age. In reunifying the country, Ahmose became the founder of the New Kingdom and the first king of the 18th dynasty, to which Hatshepsut also belonged. As the period of foreign rule in Egypt came to an end, Egypt began to build up its own empire. During the Second Intermediate Period, the Kushites had raided the south, prompting the Egyptians to expand further south into Nubia. The kingdom of Kush was firmly pushed back under Hatshepsut's father, Thutmose III, around 1500 BC, and the earlier defeat of the Hyksos during the Second Intermediate Period saw the new kingdom of Egypt expand into the Levant. It was during this time, just before Hatshepsut's reign, that the Egyptian empire reached its greatest territorial extent. Hatshepsut was directly related to these empire-expanding pharaohs. As well as her father Thutmose I, Hatshepsut was a blood relation of Ahmose IV, the unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt and the first ruler of the New Kingdom. However, although they came from the same dynasty, tracing their family connections is difficult. Ahmose I's son, Amenhotep I, was his successor, but after that, the historical record becomes unclear. Amenhotep I was succeeded by Thutmose I, but Thutmose never used the title king's son, which puts a question mark over his connection to Amenhotep. Some Egyptologists have argued that Thutmose's wife, Ahmose, was Amenhotep's sister, making Thutmose his son-in-law rather than biological son. Or he might have been Amenhotep's son born of a lesser wife, which would have restricted his use of the title king's son. It is also possible that Thutmose was a general chosen by the heirless Amenhotep to rule. However, a violent coup can be ruled out as an explanation, as the records suggest a peaceful transition of power occurred. Dynasty problems did not come to an end after the accession of Thutmose I. A recurring issue was that sons born to secondary wives and any female children were not considered ideal heirs. Thutmose I and his principal wife, Ahmose, had no surviving son, only two daughters, of whom Hatshepsut was the oldest. Thutmose did have a son, Thutmose II, with a secondary wife, Mutnefret, and it was thought best, according to tradition, that Thutmose II be quickly married to his half-sister Hatshepsut. This would strengthen the credentials of Thutmose II and preserve the direct royal line. Egyptologists of the past have presented Thutmose II as weak and frail. This presentation was not necessarily rooted in fact. It was fueled by a determination to present Hatshepsut as domineering. A shrewd Hatshepsut was supposed to have manipulated her ineffective husband and essentially ruled in his name. However, public monuments paint a different picture. A dutiful Hatshepsut is shown standing behind her husband, showing appropriate loyalty to him as the pharaoh. But the limited scale of Thutmose II's building program hinders a deeper understanding of his reign and the power his wife held. Thutmose II ruled only for a short time after his father's death. He was succeeded by his wife and half-sister Hatshepsut, for the same reason he himself had almost been passed over: the lack of a son born of the principal wife. Just like his father, Thutmose II did have a son with a secondary wife, Isis. This child, Thutmose III, could not immediately take the throne because he was very young, and like with the accession of Thutmose II, there was some concern over the child's status as the son of a secondary wife. The weakening of the direct royal line was a concern that could not be easily overlooked. Instead, as tradition indicated, Hatshepsut was to rule as co-regent for the young boy, a role which soon grew to that of a co-ruler. There had been precedents of widowed principal wives ruling as regents and dutifully handling the affairs of the government for their young sons. But the short lifespan of ancient Egyptians meant that young rulers and the requirement for regents was not unusual. Hatshepsut's royal credentials as both daughter and wife of past pharaohs were unquestionable. Thutmose III was recognized as king from the beginning of this co-regent period. which ran from 1478 BC to 1473 BC. Monuments from the time show the child king in the form of an adult, as was traditional, performing royal duties and rituals. Hatshepsut, dressed in royal female garb, is depicted off to one side, modestly watching over her stepson. However, Hatshepsut's rise to full power was not inevitable at the start of their joint reign. It was only several years later that Hatshepsut began appearing on monuments in the costume of the male pharaoh, indicating a change in status. The first example we have of this gender-swapping power dressing comes from the second year of the co-regent period, with Hatshepsut depicted in the Karnak temple complex in Thebes, wearing the robes of a female ruler but the crown of a male king. This slow adoption of the symbols of the pharaoh suggests that her rise to power was gradual rather than an abrupt coup. In around 1473 BC, Hatshepsut took on the title of King of Upper and Lower Egypt, and the regalia and other formal titles of the Pharaoh of Egypt. This was a permanent promotion. Hatshepsut could not step down when Thutmose came of age. As the role of pharaoh was a lifelong responsibility, pharaohs could not abdicate or rule temporarily. But even at this time, when her power was at its height, she ruled as a co-ruler with Thutmose III. The reasons behind Hatshepsut's decision to take on the full titles of kingship are lost to history. She may have been acting to safeguard the throne for Thutmose III, as the deaths of Thutmose's mother, Isis, and Hatshepsut's mother, Ahmose, removed the remaining links to the previous royal generation and perhaps left Hatshepsut feeling exposed. Although 19th and 20th century Egyptologists were keen to present Hatshepsut as an ambitious, cunning woman with an unnatural hunger for power, there is little evidence to support this view. It was more likely that Hatshepsut's instinct was to continue to rule as co-regent in the name of Thutmose III. Ruling with the full power of the pharaoh and in her own name would have been a great risk, given the existence of a legitimate heir and the limited precedence of female pharaohs. But a political crisis, perhaps a threat from an alternative branch of the royal family, forced her hand. She could not rule for Thutmose with the title of king's mother because he wasn't her son. His own mother, Isis, had been unable to take on the king's mother title because she had no royal blood. Between her own gender, Thutmose III's young age, and his limited legitimacy as the son of a secondary wife, Hatshepsut's options for establishing stable rule were very limited. In the end, she was the best placed to rule as the daughter and principal wife of two pharaohs and the holder of the influential religious title of God's wife. The title of God's wife of Amun had given her authority even before her elevation to co-regent or co-ruler. It was this title that won her the support of the priests. The god's wife led festivals to the god Amun, one of the ancient Egyptian gods, who was later merged with the ancient sun god to become Amun-Ra, and assisted the high priest in his sacred duties at the great temple of Amun at Karnak. She was held in high regard because it was believed she had direct interaction with Amun, who was revered in Thebes as the creator god and, later, king of the gods. The god's wife had enough influence and power to dictate policy, as ancient Egypt was a priest-led society where religion and government were deeply intertwined. Hatshepsut was the last god's wife for many decades, perhaps because the role bestowed enormous power, privilege, and wealth on the woman who held this title. Hatshepsut's experience leading religious rituals and working closely with the priests stood her in good stead for the duties of a pharaoh. As well as leading religious processions and festivals, pharaohs had a more direct divine responsibility. Ancient Egyptians saw their pharaohs as a link between the gods and the human race. Pharaohs would be responsible for direct communication with the 42 state gods and goddesses, and were charged with maintaining the cosmic order established during creation, called Ma'at. In many cases, pharaohs themselves were seen as semi-divine beings, with some believed to be born of Amun-Ra, including Hatshepsut, and when they died would become fully fledged divine beings. As well as the support of the priests, Hatshepsut would have relied on the favor of the royal family and the courtiers. Arguments that the cunning Hatshepsut sought to overthrow her stepson and rule alone are undermined by the fact that the ancient Egyptian royal family relied on the support of other elite groups. The risk of being overthrown would have reminded Hatshepsut that she was answerable to others. It seems likely that the courtiers, as well as the priests, supported Hatshepsut's rise to power. Only 70 years before her reign, Egypt had been divided during the Second Intermediate Period, with large regions ruled by other groups, including the Hyksos in the north and the Kingdom of Kush in the south. Courtiers relied on the royal family for their privileged positions, and the loss of this royal line would have threatened their power and caused widespread turmoil. Stability and prosperity were the aims of the day, and Hatshepsut, along with the shining legacy of her father, Thutmose I, seemed to offer just that. There is no surviving evidence that suggests Hatshepsut faced any major challenges to her reign. Although she technically ruled as a co-ruler with her stepson, it was clear that Hatshepsut was in charge, with her stepson happy to lead her army and not use this power against her. Despite 19th and 20th century attempts to present this co-ruling duo as in conflict, with Thutmose seen as embittered by his stepmother's rising power, there is little evidence of this. The pieces of evidence which have reached us in the present show a harmonious working relationship. While he grew up, Thutmose valued Hatshepsut's experience of ruling, including during her father's reign while he fought in campaigns, her guidance, and her illustrious status as a direct descendant of the royal bloodline. Without the public and elite support Hatshepsut had won, it is possible that the infant Thutmose would have lost the throne to another. It was perhaps the fear of her royal line losing the kingship that encouraged Hatshepsut to become pharaoh. Her claim to more power was supported, and she received the official regalia of the pharaoh, including the cat headcloth featuring the uraeus, the rearing cobra, a traditional false beard, and shendit kilt. Many statues survive, showing Hatshepsut in this androgynous royal attire. In reliefs, she is shown striding forward and standing tall, as well as in the traditional pious kneeling posture, rather than the modest postures of Egyptian female figures. The feminine ankle-length dress and closed feet stance are rarely used in images of Hatshepsut. Women could have high status in ancient Egypt and had legal rights to property, unlike in many other ancient and modern civilizations. There had been examples of powerful Egyptian women, including Hatshepsut's own mother, Ahmosi, who wielded great influence as the king's daughter. Throughout ancient Egyptian history, many mortal women were worshipped as goddesses, and both before and after Hatshepsut, women reigned as pharaohs. Khentkaus III, Nitocris, and Sobekneferu had all ruled in some capacity prior to Hatshepsut, and Nefertari, Tusret, and Cleopatra were just some of the important female rulers who came after her. But there was no word for queen in ancient Egypt. King's wife was the title given to those who married the pharaoh. The ruler was called the king or pharaoh, no matter their gender. And female pharaohs, that is, women who ruled fully under their own name and with the regalia and titles of pharaoh, were not common. Before Hatshepsut, there had only been Sobekneferu, who had reigned 6 dynasties before her and had taken on the male title of king. As the office of pharaoh was a distinctly male one, adaptation was necessary for female rulers. The symbolism of ancient Egyptian kingship, the crook and flail, and the uraeus and masculine dress was designed for male rulers, given that the role usually passed from father to son. In the majority of the statues and works of art that have survived until the modern day, Hatshepsut is presented as a masculine king. This was one of the reasons why it took Egyptologists so long to identify her. Hieroglyphic inscriptions said, "female king," but the imagery was almost entirely masculine. Presenting herself as a male king wasn't deceitful, it was tradition. Egyptian art often presented things as they should be, rather than how they are. Older kings and infant kings, like Thutmose III, were also presented as having youthful, trim, masculine physiques. She presented herself as other kings did. Relief scenes show Hatshepsut completing historic kingly rituals, from making offerings to the gods and celebrating festivals, to trampling foreign captives in the form of a sphinx. Hatshepsut did not completely hide her femininity as she took on the masculine attributes of kingship. She replaced the traditional male titles and epithets used on hieroglyphic labels, on statues and reliefs with feminine variations. Her name was often followed by daughter of Re, and the feminine word ending she used led to grammatical contradictions like His Majesty herself. In private spaces, statues of Hatshepsut depicted her with a mix of male and female attributes. Two rare examples of these statues, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, show her with the masculine headdress of the pharaoh combined, with an obvious feminine silhouette, or even in full feminine dress. It was in public spaces, such as on the processional way, that her statues presented her as a young king in the prime of life. When in sphinx form, kneeling or standing, Hatshepsut's statues sought to portray her as the ideal male king. She also called on the religious aspects of the pharaoh to bolster her legitimacy. She styled herself as Matkare, meaning truth is the soul of the sun god, to emphasize her connection to Amun. One myth even has her as the demigod child of Amun. She aimed to highlight her moral responsibilities as pharaoh. Mat, meaning the truth, order, and justice bestowed by the gods, referred to her ability as the legitimate pharaoh to communicate with the gods. This title plainly stated that she was destined to help maintain Maat and bring stability and prosperity to Egypt. Hatshepsut's legitimacy was further strengthened by the proclamation of the Oracle of Amun. The oracle declared that Hatshepsut's rise to become pharaoh was, in fact, Amun's will. Hatshepsut promoted the words of the oracle by carving the following proclamation on many of her grand monuments. Welcome my sweet daughter, my favorite, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Matkare, Hatshepsut. Thou art the pharaoh, taking possession of the two lands. But even the oracle's words did not make Hatshepsut lose sight of the fact that she was a co-ruler. She ordered a relief to be made to showcase her rise to power, which showed both herself and Thutmose III. This relief was placed in the Red Chapel, a sacred building in the sanctuary of Amun-Ra at the Temple of Karnak, which housed the Userhat-Amun, a golden boat used by the god Amun to travel around. Both she and her co-ruler Thutmose were presented as men, but Hatshepsut now took the place of precedence. The words of Amun, via the oracle, and this visual representation of her power in a place sacred to Amun, emphasized her divine right to be pharaoh. To highlight her legitimacy, Hatshepsut also emphasized her connection to her father, Pharaoh Thutmose. She appeared to idolize her father, who had won fame for his military victories and expansion. When Hatshepsut was a young child, he had returned from his victory against the Kushans in Nubia, with the naked body of a Nubian chieftain displayed on the prow of his ship. Thutmose's expansion of the Egyptian empire had vastly increased its prosperity. By presenting herself as her father's chosen successor, she tied herself to his illustrious legacy and to a long line of successful pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. However, historical evidence to support Hatshepsut's claim of being her father's named successor has not been found. The claim seems especially doubtful given that Hatshepsut was married to her half-brother Thutmose II to strengthen his claim as heir. Tradition dictated that sons, even those of secondary wives, took precedence over daughters. Historically, women had only come to power when no male successor was available. So it seems unlikely that Thutmose I would have named Hatshepsut as his successor. But Hatshepsut ensured that her version of history would persevere by inscribing her claim on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Then His Majesty said to them, "This daughter of mine, Khnumetamun Hatshepsut, may she live, I have appointed as my successor upon my throne. She shall direct the people in every sphere of the palace. It is she indeed who shall lead you. Obey her words, unite yourselves at her command." The royal nobles, the dignitaries, and the leaders of the people heard this proclamation of the promotion of his daughter, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Matkare. May she live eternally. Visual representations and inscriptions in buildings were important parts of Egyptian history and successful kingship. Without these architectural works, little would be known of ancient Egypt today. But more importantly, building programs gave the pharaohs the opportunity for self-promotion and legend building. The achievements of the pharaohs would live on in their architectural works long after they were gone. And Hatshepsut understood this better than anyone. Hatshepsut has been remembered predominantly for her influence on the arts. Her reign saw a cultural renaissance that was to have a lingering effect on Egyptian art and architecture for a millennium. She was one of the most prolific pharaoh builders, with thousands of projects throughout Upper and Lower Egypt, and especially around the city of Thebes. Many temples were built to display her piety and bolster her claim to semi-divine status as the god's wife of Amun. She also sought to promote her own accomplishments and show off the wealth her policies had brought to Egypt. It was a chance for her to write her own story and ensure that she would not be forgotten. Her buildings were of a much grander style than her predecessors and were so impressive that later rulers attempted to claim them as their own. She ordered the production of so much statuary that every major museum in the world has pieces from Hatshepsut's reign in their ancient Egypt collections, including a whole room dedicated to her pieces at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. The vastness of her building and statuary projects has left us important evidence about her as a ruler and about how she wanted to be perceived. The grandest of all Hatshepsut's building projects was, as was traditional, the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, which still exists. Ancient Egyptian mortuary temples were not so much about death as they were a celebration of the eternal life of the pharaoh and their union with the god Amun. A mortuary temple was built for Hatshepsut in the complex at Deir el-Bahari on the west bank of the Nile River, across from the ancient city of Thebes and the modern city of Luxor. It was built into the cliff face, looking towards the Karnak temple complex on the opposite side of the Nile, where prestigious temples and monuments had been constructed. She chose a site that would add to her prestige. Her temple was built next to that of Mentuhotep II, the first king of the Middle Kingdom, and the man who had reunified Upper and Lower Egypt. The plot had originally been quarried for her father's tomb. Hatshepsut linked her own mortuary temple to that of her father's, showing her devotion to him and tying their legacies together to emphasize her legitimacy. She sought to present herself as the rightful successor and dutiful daughter of Thutmose I. She even created a mortuary cult for him in her temple, and later moved his body there so that they would lie together. Hatshepsut and her father Thutmose I were not the only kings to designate their final resting places in this region. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple was so illustrious that future pharaohs built their own mortuary temples near hers, forming what is now known as the Valley of the Kings. Architectural innovation dominated the design of Hatshepsut's temple. It began as a small project in the shadow of Mentuhotep II's tomb. The project grew into a large terraced monument that had to be cut into the cliff face, showcasing impressive architectural skill. It was enormous, almost the size of 2.5 football fields. It featured so many colonnades and courtyards upon its terraces that it appeared to rise up the side of the mountain. Hatshepsut moved away from the fortress-like designs used by her predecessors and pioneered a more ornate, aesthetically pleasing look. Her beautiful architectural style inspired many future building projects and mortuary temples. Although many of the intricate elements of her original design are now missing, there is enough evidence left behind to piece together what the temple would have looked like in its heyday. The lower levels of her temple were softened with luscious gardens and reflective pools. The myrrh trees from the famous trade expedition she sent to the semi-mythical land of Punt were planted here to highlight her link with the gods and the wealth and exotic goods she had brought to Egypt. The likeness of Hatshepsut appeared in the temple's design many times over. Over 100 statues of the female pharaoh in the form of a sphinx lined the processional way. These Hatshepsut sphinxes were placed here because the sphinx was seen as a spiritual guardian. This form also had the benefit of removing any signs of gender. The sphinx was always the head of the pharaoh and the body of a lion, sometimes with the addition of falcon's wings. More images of Hatshepsut were placed on the temple's terraces. Some of these statues were over 10 feet tall and were intended to be seen from a great distance. Several show Hatshepsut in devotional poses, such as kneeling amongst offerings to the gods, or even taking on the appearance of Osiris, god of resurrection. The majority of the statues of Hatshepsut show her in a masculine light, in the appearance of the traditionally male pharaoh. Many of them have survived, some whole and some in fragments, into the present. The centerpiece of the project was the Djeza Djeseru, the Holy of Holies, the center of the mortuary temple which was accessed along a large causeway. It was a symmetrical, multi-columned structure, similar in appearance to the Parthenon in Athens, which was built nearly 1,000 years later. The Djeza Djeseru sat back in the cliff face and at the top of the grand terraces. In the Djeza Djeseru were altars to Amun-Ra and to Hatshepsut, where her cult would continue to worship her even after her death. As well as their religious function, mortuary temples would glorify the pharaoh. The reliefs inside Hatshepsut's temple celebrated the achievements of her reign. The trading expedition to semi-mythical Punt on the Red Sea was represented. On the relief, sailors and traders load exotic luxury goods onto the Egyptian ships, from panther skins to frankincense, as well as the myrrh trees which were planted at the temple. The accompanying inscription reads, "Never were such things brought to any king since the world was." This relief showed Hatshepsut as a successful economic and religious leader. The trading mission to Punt was just one of many trade routes developed under her reign, and the prosperity they brought to Egypt was a significant part of the Third Golden Age. It also showed Hatshepsut as a successful religious leader, as these new exotic goods were thought to be especially desirable to the gods. Another significant relief showed Hatshepsut's divine conception and birth. Hatshepsut encouraged the narrative that she was the biological daughter of the god Amun, who had appeared to her mother in the form of her husband, Thutmose I. The later trend for emphasizing a pharaoh's divine birth is believed to have begun with Hatshepsut, who needed to legitimize her claim to the throne. Hatshepsut sought to highlight the sacred link between the pharaoh and the gods, in particular her personal link with Amun. It was the first time a pharaoh had built a mortuary temple that was primarily a temple to the god Amun. As well as the altar to Amun, new religious rituals were established to celebrate Amun and his connection with the pharaoh. For example, during a festival of the dead, the cult statue of Amun was sailed across the river to spend a night in Hatshepsut's tomb. The religious rituals she created, usually the privilege of male kings, would have been as important as the buildings she commissioned and were clear evidence that she was the legitimate pharaoh. The landscape of Egypt was fundamentally altered by Hatshepsut's building projects, as well as her mortuary temple in Deir el-Bahari, she added, and restored many more temples and monuments across Egypt. Monuments were constructed at the Temple of Karnak, as was the tradition under most pharaohs. The Red Chapel was built here, which was a religious chapel dedicated to Amun and featured carvings showing key moments from Hatshepsut's life. A pair of obelisks were constructed to celebrate her 16th year as pharaoh. This momentous construction was commemorated on a relief that showed the 450-ton obelisks being transported along the Nile by 27 ships. As well as telling the story of her reign, the obelisks have allowed archaeologists a glimpse at Hatshepsutian architectural design and construction. The discovery of the unfinished obelisk, a broken version left in the quarry in Aswan where it was made, shows the hard work, craftsmanship, and innovation that went into creating these monuments. Hatshepsut also ordered the restoration of great monuments. The precinct of Mut, the mother goddess of Egypt, had been sacked during the Hyksos occupation and was rebuilt under Hatshepsut. The new design featured twin obelisks at the temple's entrance that, at the time, were the tallest in the world. One of them still stands today and is the second tallest ancient obelisk still upright. The restoration of the Mut precinct was a building project so magnificent that later pharaohs pillaged it for features to bolster their own projects. Other important building projects ordered by Hatshepsut included the Temple of Pakhet at Beni Hassan, south of Al-Minya. The temple mixed the cultures north and south of the area by being dedicated to both Bast and Sekhmet, two lioness war goddesses. Inside was a denunciation of the Hyksos by Hatshepsut. In it, she claimed that the Hyksos occupation of Egypt had created a cultural decline that was reversed by Hatshepsut herself. The huge underground temple was admired by the Greeks when they occupied Egypt during the Ptolemaic dynasty, as it bore resemblance to their own hunter goddess, Artemis, and was renamed by them the Speos Artemidos. As with other impressive buildings, a later pharaoh, this time Seti I of the 19th dynasty, attempted to wipe Hatshepsut's name from the project and replace it with his own. Hatshepsut also devoted time and money to public works programs. These works were mainly focused on the area around Thebes, the dynastic and religious center of the Thutmose Hatshepsut era. A network of roads and sanctuaries were built, which encouraged access to religious sites, and were also used for royal and theological processions. The transformation of the physical and ritual landscape of Egypt was not Hatshepsut's only accomplishment. She also brought huge wealth to Egypt by bolstering its diplomatic and trading links, and by being uninterested in expensive wars. This was important as her innovations in architecture and ritual art required huge expenditure. It also pleased the elites who desired access to exotic goods and wealth in order to display their status. Maintaining the Golden Age ensured Hatshepsut the support and loyalty she needed to rule. Hatshepsut came from a line of economically and culturally successful pharaohs. Her ancestor, Ramesses I, had reunified Egypt after the turbulent Second Intermediate Period, triggering a golden age, and her father Thutmose I had strengthened Egypt, leaving her a prosperous and expanding nation to rule. Spurred on by the economic growth and stability of the last few decades, the elites in Hatshepsut's court began to develop a cosmopolitan outlook. An interest in the technological and luxury goods in East Africa and Arabia belonged to the 18th dynasty period as a whole, but was particularly significant under Hatshepsut. There is archaeological evidence that new goods arrived in Egypt during the early part of the 18th dynasty, from new musical instruments to oil. Hatshepsut supported this more outward-facing worldview and the desire for foreign goods by building and reforming foreign ties. She sent expeditions to foreign lands to the south and the east and encouraged foreign embassies to visit with diplomatic gifts, which increased her prestige. She built new trading links to gain access to desirable goods, from frankincense, which was charred to make coal eyeliner, to oil and the latest military weapons. She worked to re-establish the trade networks disrupted by the Hyksos occupation of Egypt. She was particularly interested in reopening ancient trade routes as she sought to go back to the ancient traditions of kingship, ritual, and trade. Foreign trade was vital to a pharaoh because luxury goods were a symbol of royal power and legitimacy, but also had an important religious aspect. Exotic goods, such as frankincense, which was believed to make a place divine through its smell, and myrrh, were thought to impress the gods, especially the god Amun, whose name was used to legitimize Hatshepsut's trade missions. Towards the middle of her reign, Hatshepsut sent a large trade embassy fleet to the semi-mythical land of Punt. This fleet was made up of 5 ships, each 21 meters long, with several sails and 210 sailors. As Punt was located somewhere on the Red Sea, perhaps in East Africa or Arabia, the fleet was required to flat-pack their ships and carry them over 100 miles from the River Nile to the Red Sea. The expedition was successful and returned with frankincense, gold, ivory, exotic animals, panther skins, and, for the first time in recorded history, live trees. The expedition was commemorated in a relief at her mortuary temple and in many other tombs and temples on the west bank of the Nile. The prosperity that resulted from Hatshepsut's diplomatic and trading policies was unhindered by military expenses. Although her father had won fame through military victories and expansion, Hatshepsut pursued a peaceful foreign policy. The only possible exceptions to her peaceful reign were raiding expeditions to Byblos and the Sinai Peninsula and campaigns against Nubia and Canaan. An early, successful and short campaign in Nubia is shown on a relief at Hatshepsut's temple, though this militaristic relief does not take pride of place. Hatshepsut's foreign policy was directed at diplomacy and trade. An important element in Hatshepsut's success was her astute selection of loyal officials. These hand-picked officials controlled the key government posts that were essential for effective rule, from diplomacy to monument building. The most notable of these officials was Senenmut, who, among many other titles, was the overseer of all royal works. Senenmut came from a non-royal, non-elite family, and perhaps had a military background. He rose quickly within royal circles after becoming the tutor of Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferuer. The number of his titles and responsibilities increased dramatically. According to some Egyptologists, he had as many as 93 titles, including the prestigious Great Steward of Amun. His responsibilities in this important role included taking care of the estates of the god Amun, which would have brought him huge material wealth. As the overseer of all royal works, he also played a leading role in Hatshepsut's building projects, including possibly designing her mortuary temple. The trust Hatshepsut had in him is evident in the responsibilities she gave him regarding her daughter, her most prized god, and the temple in which she would be laid to rest. Senenmut took advantage of his new wealth and prestige by building himself 2 tombs and at least 26 statues, more than any other non-royal. The masses of images and text about Senenmut represented a huge change in the way non-royals were presented. He even had images of himself praying placed in Hatshepsut's temple, though they were hidden discreetly behind doors that would have been left open when the public could enter the temple. For ancient Egyptians, this merging of royal and non-royal effigies in a sacred temple would have been unusual and even distasteful. As Senenmut never married, and Hatshepsut didn't remarry after her husband's death, it has been suggested that they were lovers. 3 somewhat unconvincing pieces of evidence have been used to support this claim. Firstly, the titles and honors Hatshepsut bestowed on him, despite his non-elite status. Secondly, the fact that Senenmut's name features in Hatshepsut's mortuary temple more than her husband's name. And thirdly, a statue, now in the Neues Museum in Berlin, shows Senenmut hugging a female child believed to be Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferuer. This third piece of evidence certainly highlights an unusual bond between Senenmut, his royal tutee Neferuer, and Hatshepsut, because non-aristocrats were not allowed to touch royalty. However, there is no strong evidence to support the argument that Hatshepsut and Senenmut had a physical relationship. While an example of temple graffiti showing a sexual relationship between a man and a woman who may or may not be wearing the headdress of the pharaoh has been suggested as being Hatshepsut and Senenmut, there is no evidence to support this. Identification. It is clear that Hatshepsut trusted and relied upon her advisor Senenmut, and that he had successfully made a space for himself in the close-knit royal family circle. But there is no legitimate evidence that they were lovers. After a long reign which spanned 2 decades, Hatshepsut died in the 22nd year of her rule. Although the precise date of her death is unclear, her successor, Thutmose III, recorded the start of his reign on the 16th of January 1458 BC. In that year, he took on the title ruler of Ma'at for the first time, signaling that Hatshepsut had died. She is thought to have died in her late 40s and had lived what was considered a relatively long life in ancient times. No record of the cause of death has survived. It is believed that Hatshepsut was initially interned with her father, Thutmose I, as she had wished. However, Thutmose I's body was later moved elsewhere by Thutmose III. Hatshepsut's mummy was perhaps also moved at this time, with her new location most commonly believed to be in the tomb of her nurse, Sitra-In. This change was perhaps ordered by Amenhotep II, son of Thutmose III, by a secondary wife, as he sought to secure his own uncertain legitimacy to rule. Given this confusion, Hatshepsut's mummy has been difficult for Egyptologists to find. Her mortuary temple, recorded as Tomb KV20, did not contain any likely candidates. But in 1902, archaeologist Howard Carter, who found the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered a second possible location for Hatshepsut's final resting place, Tomb KV60, which had been the burial place of her nurse Sitra-in. This second site seemed to fit in with the story of her body being moved to a more discreet location by her successors. Inside this tomb, 2 female mummies were found, and one was positively identified as Hatshepsut's nurse. The other was not identified. It was not until 2007 that archaeologist Zahi Hawass released a statement to the scientific community claiming that this second female mummy was indeed Hatshepsut. The process of identification was unconventional as the DNA had not survived well enough for testing. Instead, a missing tooth in a box with Hatshepsut's name on it was reunited with this mummy, and it seemed to be a perfect fit. If this was Hatshepsut's mummy, it can shed some light on her mysterious death. This mummy showed signs of bone cancer, perhaps caused by a benzopyrene carcinogenic skin lotion found with the body. Her family was said to suffer from a genetic, inflammatory skin disease, so perhaps the lotion had been used to soothe this condition. However, the tooth may have belonged to a later royal lady of the same name from the 21st dynasty. Equally, the hand position of the mummy was that of a king's wife, not a pharaoh, which suggests it wasn't her. In 2011, the identification of the missing tooth was proven to be false. The tooth was a lower molar, while the mummy from KV60 was missing an upper molar. Doubt was cast on Hawass's theory, but calls for the DNA testing of the tooth were halted by Hawass and the Cairo Museum, who wanted to protect it against the destruction caused by the testing process. To further complicate matters, Hatshepsut's funerary furniture has been found at several different sites across the Valley of the Kings. These items included a wide range of goods, from a throne-like bedstead to red jasper game pieces, all displaying her favoured lioness symbol and a partial shabti or funerary figurine. The true location of Hatshepsut's mummy, if Hawass's mummy is to be discounted, may simply never be found. Hatshepsut's resting place has been hard to find because after 2 decades as pharaoh, she disappeared from history. She is missing from the roll list of kings, and the scribes never mentioned her. Her many monuments and temples were ascribed to later pharaohs, and she appears in vague references to a female ruler around that time, sometimes as an Ramesses or an Amenenthe, but her name had vanished. Hatshepsut was returned to history in 1822 AD, when her name was found on a statue of what appeared to be a male ruler by Jean-François Champollion, decipherer of the Rosetta Stone. The hieroglyphic inscription on this masculine statue stated that it actually depicted a female ruler. The statue had been found in the inner chambers of Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari. Everything in the public-facing areas had been completely erased. Even when Hatshepsut did appear in the historical narrative around the 19th century, Egyptologists often described her as a usurper. She was seen as a manipulative woman with an unnatural lust for power at the expense of her young stepson. She was interpreted as a vain, ambitious, and unscrupulous woman by Metropolitan Museum curator William Hayes in 1953, who excavated her funerary temple in the 1920s, alongside curator Herbert Winlock. The scholarly consensus in the 19th and 20th centuries was that Hatshepsut had seized power rather than inherited it. Discoveries of pits full of broken Hatshepsut statues in the 1920s and 1930s only encouraged the view that Hatshepsut had stolen the throne from Thutmose III, who later avenged himself upon her legacy. The attack on Hatshepsut's image seems brutal enough to be personal. The heads of her statue had been severed, and the cobra symbol of royalty hacked from her forehead. The pharaohs were regarded as godlike, often as the physical representation of the gods, so this defilement was blasphemous. Other powerful women had been spared this treatment, but Hatshepsut had ruled not as a king's mother, as several other ancient Egyptian women had, but as a female king. These kings' mothers were honored for generations, often more so than the principal wife, showing that a woman holding power was not inappropriate to the ancient Egyptian mind. But female regnants and female pharaohs were hounded out of history, perhaps because they were succeeded not by their sons, but by others with weaker ties to the royal line and limited legitimacy. Destroying the public memory of these female rulers would strengthen the position of these later kings. The attempted erasure of Hatshepsut from history was carried out possibly towards the end of Thutmose III's reign, and more certainly during the reign of his son, Amenhotep II. The erasure was carried out in a haphazard way. Crude cover-ups and additions aimed to hide her name and image by replacing her with Thutmose I or Thutmose II. Her image was chiseled off stone walls. Her name was removed from monuments, and gaps were left in works of art. Her statues were pulled down and smashed. In 1927, when curator Herbert Winlock discovered a pit full of smashed Hatshepsut statues, he assumed this proved she had usurped the throne and later been struck from history for this reason. The real reason why this incomplete rewriting of history occurred is unknown. Answers posed by archaeologists have included self-promotion and cost-saving. There was a tradition of rulers reusing the grand burial monuments and statuary of older pharaohs for themselves. It has been argued that Amenhotep II, as co-ruler toward the end of his father's reign, had ordered the defacing of Hatshepsut's monuments. His legitimacy was perhaps questioned by Hatshepsut's legacy, as he was not related to her, and she held the purer line of descent from the great old pharaohs. He also broke from royal tradition by not recording the names of his wives and ending the powerful roles and titles of royal women, including that of God's wife. Older explanations that Thutmose III had co-reigned with Hatshepsut unwillingly and had attempted to erase her from history out of bitterness have since been overturned. Thutmose had the power, as leader of her army, to overthrow Hatshepsut if he had so wanted. Even after her death, her images remained in view on public buildings for 20 years during his reign. The haphazard nature of the erasures also challenges the view that Thutmose was taking long-awaited revenge against Hatshepsut. The masses of images of her would not have survived to the present if the motive had been hatred and jealousy. Only the most visible, most accessible images of Hatshepsut were removed. Access to her image was maintained beyond the reach of the public eye. It has been suggested that her image and name survived out of the public eye because whoever had orchestrated her erasure had wanted to avoid sacrilege. Mortuary temples were built to honor the gods, but also to provide a home for the cult of that particular pharaoh. The cult of the pharaoh would continue to worship the pharaoh after they had died, performing rituals which renewed the pharaoh's divinity. It was believed that after their death, pharaohs became fully divine and assimilated with Osiris, god of reincarnation, and Ra, god of the sun. Given this view of Egyptian kingship, whoever erased Hatshepsut may have deliberately avoided tarnishing her divinity. Another theory was that Thutmose aimed to relegate Hatshepsut to the position of regent, the traditional role of powerful women, in order to safeguard future royal succession patterns. The achievements of Hatshepsut's reign were evidence that the traditional male role of pharaoh could be successfully held by a woman. Hatshepsut proved, more so than other ancient Egyptian female rulers, that a woman could rule during a long, prosperous, and expansive period. It would also have simplified Thutmose III's own claim to the throne by implying that he inherited it directly from Thutmose II, the named heir of Thutmose I. This would explain why only public celebrations of Hatshepsut and her accomplishments were erased and why her name was removed from king lists. If the reinterpretation was an attempt to smooth the path for his son's succession, this would explain why the attack on Hatshepsut only began towards the end of Thutmose III's reign. Whatever the motive, the brutal but haphazard erasure of Hatshepsut resulted in an incomplete picture of her when she was rescued from history. The destruction of her image and monuments has been wrongly interpreted as evidence that she was a power-hungry woman who deserved to be erased. But as cultural attitudes towards women in power have changed, so too have views of Hatshepsut. Instead of asking how she had tricked her way to power and manipulated her stepson, historians today debate the circumstances which allowed Hatshepsut to come to power, her relationship with her co-ruler Thutmose III, and why he might have tried to destroy her memory 20 years after her death. She broke tradition by ruling as regent for a son who was not her own. She broke tradition by ruling as regent for a son who was not her own. She was only the second woman to become pharaoh and rule under her own name. she strengthened female kingship and built extensive temples to publicly celebrate her reign. Many women went on to hold positions of power, including becoming pharaoh after her, but she was perhaps given this power by men seeking to further their own wealth and influence. Her heritage and her record as the god's wife and as a placeholder ruler while her father was on military campaigns had perhaps convinced elites that she was uniquely placed to rule Egypt at a time of prosperity. She was, as historian Kara Cooney states, the only woman to have ever taken power as a king in ancient Egypt during a time of prosperity and expansion. And then she was erased from history. There is evidence to suggest that Hatshepsut herself was conscious that her legacy might be deliberately buried. On a second pair of obelisks at Karnak, she had the following inscription inscribed: "Now my heart turns this way and that, as I think what the people will say, those who shall see my monuments in years to come, and who shall speak of what I have done." Although she temporarily disappeared from history and was not the most famous female pharaoh, a distinction reserved for Cleopatra, Hatshepsut arguably left the greatest cultural legacy of any pharaoh. Her monuments and temples inspired thousands of architectural works even after she was gone. Some of the greatest architectural wonders of the ancient world, including her mortuary temple, were built during her reign. Masses of exotic goods, artifacts, artworks, and monuments found from Hatshepsut's reign show that she laid the foundations of the golden age of the new kingdom. Ancient Egypt undoubtedly flourished under her rule. What do you think of Hatshepsut? Was she an effective and legitimate ruler? Or was she a scheming stepmother removed from history because she had stolen the throne? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The pharaoh known by history as Tutankhamun was born in the middle of the 14th century BC during the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt. Although we cannot be sure of his exact date or even year of birth, it is generally agreed that it occurred sometime in the late 1340s. BC. Tutankhamun's parentage is disputed, though his father was most probably Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt as Amenhotep IV before he established a monotheistic religion known as Atonism, focused on the worship of the sun, Diska 10, beginning about 5 years before Tutankhamun was born. Around the same time, he changed his name to Akhenaten. Akhenaten had at least 6 daughters with his great royal wife, Queen Nefertiti. It is possible that she was also Tutankhamun's mother. Alternatively, his mother may have been a wife of Akhenaten's, known only as the Younger Lady. At the time of his birth, Tutankhamun was given the name Tutankhaten, or the living image of a 10, in honor of the sun god. Despite being one of the best-known pharaohs or kings of ancient Egypt as a result of the discovery of his tomb and famous death mask by Howard Carter in 1922, details of Tutankhamun's short life and reign are still being pieced together by archaeologists and Egyptologists using artifacts from his tomb and other evidence. He is likely to have been born in Amarna, the modern-day name of Akhenaton, the short-lived capital city founded by his father on the eastern bank of the River Nile, around 200 miles to the south of Egypt's modern-day capital of Cairo. The young Egyptian prince was born with a club foot on his left leg, forcing him to use a walking stick throughout his life. He was brought up by his wet nurse, a woman named Maya, from his father's harem. Among the artifacts found in Tutankhamun's tomb are toys he owned and played with as a child, including an ivory monkey with moving arms and a small wooden bird. At around the age of 4, he learned how to write, starting with the cursive hieratic script used on a daily basis before moving on to the formal and sacred hieroglyphs found on ancient Egyptian monuments. Tutankhaten learned to write by copying out ancient texts, which also offered political wisdom for kings and princes preparing for kingship. He would also have studied administration, geography, history, diplomacy, and religion, as well as the theory and practice of warfare, which included chariot riding and archery. Tutankhaten grew up during a revolutionary period in Egyptian history, driven by his father's religious changes. The traditional Egyptian polytheistic belief system involved the worship of many different gods, amongst whom the creator god Amun and the sun god Ra were most prominent. However, Akhenaten had introduced the cult of the Aten, a sun god depicted as a golden disk with rays of light radiating downwards in a fan, while Akhenaten allowed his subjects to continue worshipping the traditional gods, only stipulating that Aten was the supreme god. By the 9th year of his reign, a few years before Tutankhamun's birth, Aten was increasingly portrayed as the preeminent deity. Under the new religion, the Aten was regarded as the creator of the world and everything within it, and each morning at sunrise, the king would make offerings to the Aten at the temples he built in his capital. Akhenaten identified as the son of Aten and served as the chief priest of his cult, and it is possible that Tutankhamun received his religious instruction directly from his father. During his travels with his tutors across the country, the prince may have seen the names of the old gods being removed from monuments, even while many people continued to worship them. The boy may also have noticed the different artistic styles in the old temples and the new civic buildings rising up from the desert around him in Akhenaten. Around the 14th year of Akhenaten's reign, when Tutankhamun was around 6 years old, the latter's sister or half-sister, Princess Meketaten, died at the age of 10. While her cause of death remains unknown, a plague had been spreading throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. In any case, an infectious disease is a likely explanation, as Meketaten's youngest sisters, Neferneferu and Setepenre, also died around this time. Older female members of the family followed, including Tutankhamun's grandmother, Queen Tiye, and Akhenaten's secondary wife, Queen Kaya. Following these deaths in the royal family, Akhenaten hoped to secure his succession and the continuation of his religious reforms by naming a man named Smenkhare, possibly a relative of his, as his co-regent. This Smenkhare was responsible for the construction of a great hall in Akhenaten's royal palace and was expected to be Akhenaten's successor, but died after a year or two. Akhenaten died around the same time in what was possibly the 17th year of his reign and around 1336 BC. Following Akhenaten's death, the throne possibly passed to Smenkhare for a brief time before his death, and then appears to have passed to a king named Neferneferuaten, who may have ruled as co-regent alongside Tutankhamun. The new king is believed to have been a royal woman and may have been his eldest daughter, Meritaten, or more likely his great wife, Nefertiti. King Neferneferuaten continued to develop the cult of Aten, but was prepared to reintroduce the cult of Amun and the other gods in order to appease the followers of the traditional faith. She abandoned her plans to build a tomb at Akhenaten and instead ordered craftsmen to build a tomb and mortuary temple in the Valley of the Kings near Thebes, modern-day Luxor, the traditional capital and royal burial ground for the kings of Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC. The Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass theorized that Neferneferuaten also moved her capital to Thebes, but Shaw suggests that she remained in Akhenaten in the palace she shared with her late husband. However, she would only live another 2 years, leaving the throne to the 10-year-old Tutankhamun. By the time he ascended to the throne, the 10-year-old King Tutankhamun was still a child receiving his education and could not be expected to exercise royal power by himself. He was therefore advised by courtiers and officials much older than him who had served his father, Akhenaten. His most influential advisor was Ai, a relative who may have been the brother of his grandmother, Queen Tiye, while a man named Maya controlled the treasury. As for military matters, the young king relied on the advice of General Horemheb, commander of the Egyptian army. Although these men had dutifully promoted Atenism during the previous reigns, the calamities of recent years, including the plague and the deaths of royal family members in quick succession, were interpreted as a sign of divine punishment for neglecting the worship of the old gods. With Akhenaten and Nefertiti gone, Tutankhamun's courtiers now had the opportunity to educate the new pharaoh in the old religion and persuade him to return to the old ways and restore divine favor to the realm. Although the king's advisors wielded considerable power and influence, Tutankhamun would have been required to perform ceremonial tasks and to announce important decisions in person, even as a child ruler. As with all Egyptian pharaohs, he had important religious duties as chief priest of the state religion. As part of the coronation ceremony that marked his assumption of royal authority, the young king was transformed from a human being into a living god. The rituals were conducted according to the old traditions, with offerings made to Amun, his wife, the mother goddess Mut, and their son Khonsu, god of the moon. Priests and priestesses represented gods and goddesses who placed various crowns upon the king's head, including the red crown of Lower Egypt, the white crown of Upper Egypt, and the blue crown worn by 18th dynasty pharaohs during war and religious ceremonies. The king was then given his crook and flail, symbols of royal power in Egypt. According to Egyptian royal tradition, the pharaoh would have chosen 4 extra names to reflect his personal qualities and regal majesty. Of these 4 royal names, only one is known. His throne name, Neb-Khepurura, meaning Lord of Manifestations, is Ra. While Tutankhamun still used his birth name when he assumed the throne, not long afterward, the Aten in the king's name was replaced by Amun. Thus, Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun. King Tutankhamun would have been crowned alongside his wife and half-sister, Ankhesenamun, one of the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The marriage of siblings in this way was commonplace among the royals of ancient Egypt. She was a year older than Tutankhamun, and the two had already been married when the latter became king. Ankhesenamun appears to have been his only queen. The 18th dynasty was known for its powerful queens, and Ankhesenamun would have learned about the deeds of her illustrious ancestor Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who reigned a century and a half earlier and built a grand mortuary temple in the Theban necropolis near the Valley of the Kings. She had also just seen her mother Nefertiti rule Egypt as King Nefer-Neferuaten. Accordingly, Ankhesenamun was present alongside Tutankhamun throughout his reign for royal ceremonies and audiences, and corresponded with foreign rulers in her own name. Her most important duties included serving as the manifestation of the Egyptian goddesses during religious ceremonies. Of course, as in almost all other monarchies, the queen's main task was to continue the dynastic lineage by bearing the king's children. Ankhesenamun was pregnant twice, but on both occasions, her daughters were stillborn. Early in his reign, Tutankhamun's advisors persuaded him to move his capital away from Akhetaten, with power being returned to the cities of Memphis, in northern Egypt near the Nile Delta, and Thebes in the south. Memphis had been the capital of the Old Kingdom of Egypt in the 3rd millennium BC when the Great Pyramids and Sphinx were built on the Giza Plateau near the city. Thereafter, Thebes had become the capital. Following the establishment of the 18th dynasty in the mid-16th century BC, Memphis regained its importance as a political center, while Akhenaten built a temple of Aten in the city. From Memphis and Thebes, Tutankhamun and his advisors embarked on the complete reversal of Akhenaten's religious reforms. The king issued a royal decree which stated that during the previous reigns, the old gods had been neglected and had withdrawn their divine protection. As a result, Egypt was in chaos, and its armies had been defeated on the battlefield. The text adds that after Tutankhamun came to the throne and moved his court to Memphis, the old gods were venerated once again, and prosperity was restored to the land. The proclamation was inscribed into stone monuments in prominent locations around the country, such as the Temple of Karnak in Thebes. Although the text of these restoration monuments claimed that all was well once again, in reality, the process of restoration was just beginning. Tutankhamun had been brought up at his father's court in Amarna, surrounded by depictions of Aten on palace walls, and witnessed his father taking part in the elaborate rituals of worshipping the sun disk every morning. To issue a proclamation, discrediting the belief system he grew up with must have been a difficult experience for the young king. The king's closest advisors, Maya, and Horemheb, had risen to positions of influence during the reign of Akhenaten and had tombs made for them in Amarna with Atenist inscriptions, but they formed the vanguard of the move back to tradition. Is believed to have been the power behind the throne. By the end of Tutankhamun's reign, he may have assumed the office of Grand Vizier. Treasury Chief Maya was also responsible for royal construction projects, and it was he who began the work of restoring the temples to the old gods. While Akhenaten had ordered the destruction of images of the old gods, in particular Amun, Tutankhamun ordered his chief sculptor Userhat-Hatiai to repair the images or to make new ones from scratch. Meanwhile, Horemheb personally appointed men to fill the priesthoods that had been left vacant during Akhenaten's reign. Interestingly, though the temples of Aten in Amarna were closed, the temple of Aten in Memphis remained open. Around 2 or 3 years into Tutankhamun's reign, with the revival of the old religion very much underway, the former capital of Akhetaten was being abandoned by its inhabitants, taking the bodies of their relatives with them. King Tutankhamun followed suit and decided to exhume the tombs in the royal cemetery to the east of Amarna and transfer their contents to the Valley of the Kings, which had served as the royal necropolis for the pharaohs and their family members, from the reign of Thutmose I at the beginning of the 15th century BC until Akhenaten's move to Amarna. Tutankhamun ordered a new tomb to be created in the Valley of the Kings, in which he placed the body of his father Akhenaten in a coffin originally intended for Queen Kia. The body of Tutankhamun's grandmother, Queen Taye, was buried in the tomb of her husband, King Amenhotep III. As part of his duties as high priest, Tutankhamun traveled across the country to attend religious festivals. As he lacked familiarity with the complex old rituals, he relied on assistance from his chief advisor Ai. Every year, Tutankhamun would celebrate the Opet festival in Thebes. The ceremony began at the temple of Karnak, where the king stood before 3 model boats carrying statues of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, the 3 gods known collectively as the Theban Triad. After making offerings, the king led a procession to the Nile, followed by the priests carrying the boats on their shoulders. The king, queen, and effigies of the 3 gods would then travel up the river to another temple, while soldiers and courtiers marched along the riverbanks to the sound of religious hymns sung by priests and accompanied by royal musicians. Once, inside the main temple of Thebes, Tutankhamun and his priests would proceed into the inner sanctum to reenact the coronation ceremony and renew the king's divine power. While construction of the Luxor temple had begun during the reign of his grandfather, Amenhotep III, Tutankhamun carried on building work in the temple and had the colonnade hall decorated with images of him and Ankhesenamun taking part in the Opet festival. In addition to restoring the images and monuments of the old gods throughout the country, Tutankhamun initiated building projects of his own. Aside from the colonnade hall in the Temple of Luxor, he ordered the construction of a Sphinx Avenue at Karnak. Near the pyramids of Giza, Tutankhamun built a small palace for himself, which served as a hunting lodge. In his day-to-day activities, the king was assisted by his palace administration, headed by the High Steward of Memphis, Ipi, who had formerly managed Akhenaten's palace at Amarna. After Ipi's death, his office was assumed by Inuia, who had previously worked as a scribe for Maya at the treasury. As in modern royal households, a team of servants was responsible for the royal crowns and the king's vast wardrobe, which included outfits for every possible occasion. Tutankhamun's kingdom extended beyond the modern-day borders of Egypt. To the south, Egypt ruled Nubia in what is now Sudan. To the northeast, the Egyptian pharaohs vassalized the rulers of the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean region including Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria. Many of these conquests were carried out by Thutmose III, the stepson of Hatshepsut, who ruled a century before Tutankhamun and was one of the greatest military commanders in ancient Egyptian history. Accordingly, Tutankhamun held audiences with his vassals and with foreign rulers, during which he would receive expensive gifts. Many of these gifts would be given to the temple as offerings to the gods, but the king would keep some for himself, which were later found in his tomb. General Horemheb played a vital role in these meetings, transmitting messages between the king and his foreign visitors via an interpreter. As commander-in-chief of Tutankhamun's armies, Horemheb was also responsible for putting down a Nubian uprising in the 1320s BC. While Horemheb campaigned both in Nubia and in the Levant, it is unclear if the king himself was present at the battles. Although there are depictions of Tutankhamun firing arrows from his chariot, These were most likely idealized images, as the king's youth and disability would have hampered his ability to play an active part in battles. The Nubian territories were administered by a government official with the title of Viceroy of Kush. Tutankhamun appointed as his viceroy a man named Hui, who happened to be married to the chief of the royal harem. Hui supervised the collection of tribute for the king from the Nubians, including vast quantities of gold, ebony, ivory tusks, and other artistic objects. A few years into Tutankhamun's reign, Hui returned to the king's court with the tribute accompanied by a procession of Nubian princes and prisoners of war, perhaps captured during Horemheb's campaign. After a decade of hardship, the attendees at the ceremony welcomed this sign of a return to prosperity. The old gods had been returned to their rightful places. Memories of the Atenist heresy were gradually fading away, and the abandoned city of Amarna had been systematically dismantled, with the remaining traces of it being covered by the desert sands. The teenage Tutankhamun seemed secure on his throne and could be expected to exercise power in his own right within a few years. Perhaps a new golden age was imminent after the heresy of the reign of Akhenaten. During Akhenaten's reign, the Egyptians lost control of the Levantine city of Kadesh, on the border of Syria and Lebanon, a major trade hub at the time. The Hittites of eastern Turkey were expanding their empire into the Levant and captured Kadesh, replacing the Egyptian vassal Shutatara with his son Itakama, who supported the Hittites while publicly maintaining his allegiance to Egypt. Though Akhenaten had sent a military expedition to Kadesh, it failed to retake the city from the Hittites. Late in Tutankhamun's reign, the king sent Horemheb with an army aiming to retake Kadesh and reverse the humiliation suffered during his father's reign. Horemheb's campaign was commemorated in war scenes commissioned by Tutankhamun, but there is no further detail on how the campaign transpired. The city of Kadesh stood in the middle of a meander of the river Orontes with trees all around, terrain that was unfamiliar to the Egyptians. Although the depictions of the campaign show Horemheb returning to Egypt with Itakama as his prisoner of war, along with Egyptian soldiers successfully storming a fortress, the Egyptians failed to recapture Kadesh, which remained in Hittite hands, until the Egyptian king Seti IV briefly reconquered the city in the early 13th century BC. Even without achieving the primary aim of taking Kadesh, the Egyptian depictions of the campaign, which could be pure propaganda, show the Egyptian commander parading Hittite prisoners in front of Tutankhamun. The king duly provided Horemheb with rich rewards before going to the temple of Karnak to deposit a share of the spoils of war for the gods. Some of the prisoners captured by Horemheb may have been executed as a sacrifice to the gods. While Horemheb was away on campaign, Tutankhamun presided over the celebrations of the New Year festival. On the first day of the New Year, Tutankhamun sat on his throne as gifts from the royal workshops and foreign dignitaries were laid down in front of his feet. These gifts would be meticulously recorded by scribes, and the king would distribute a selection of them to his courtiers. In the evening, Tutankhamun and Ankhesenamun invited their courtiers to a banquet. The guests ate bread along with duck, ox meat, and goose, while the king was given food that had been purified at the temple, fit for a god. The New Year celebration was accompanied by large quantities of beer and wine from the royal vineyards. The king and his courtiers may have ended the day's celebrations by playing one of the board games that was found in his tomb early in the 20th century. A popular game was Senet, played on a board with 30 squares and at least 10 counters. While the rules of the game have been lost and may have evolved over the centuries, the game is likely a variation of the royal game of the oldest board game in existence dating to around 3000 BC, where players threw dice or knucklebones and raced their counters to the end of the board. Two of the game sets found in Tutankhamun's tomb were designed for travel and contained small drawers to hold the counters, and the king and queen may have kept themselves entertained during their travels across the country. Around the time of the New Year festivities, the Apis bull in Memphis had died. The bull was worshipped as an incarnation of the god Ptah, a creator god whose worship was centered in Memphis. After the death of each bull, the city's priests would search for the next incarnation with the same characteristics. A black bull with a white diamond on the top of its head and an eagle pattern on its back. Before the priests could begin their search, Tutankhamun presided over the burial ceremony for the bull at the Serapeum, the burial site for the sacred bulls in the ancient royal necropolis of Saqqara, which may have been founded by Tutankhamun's grandfather Amenhotep III. The king would have hoped that these rituals would bring his army's glory in the Levant. As he shouldered more of the burdens of government in his late teens, Tutankhamun enjoyed the opportunity to relax by going hunting. While the most common hunting weapon was the bow and arrow, the king also hunted birds from a boat, using a curved throw stick, much like a boomerang. For close combat, he had his choice of clubs, maces, or swords. The young king enjoyed hunting, while riding in a chariot, firing arrows from his bow while a charioteer steered the horses. Among the items found in Tutankhamun's tomb is a wooden chest illustrated with hunting scenes, depicting the king in his chariot with his bow drawn, targeting the mass of fleeing animals about to fall prey to his arrows. Yet his taste for hunting would prove fatal. During the 9th year of his reign, Tutankhamun was out hunting when he fell from his chariot. As the king fell to the ground, he broke his left leg and lay bleeding. His servants carried him back to his palace and onto his bed. With Ankhesenamun at his side, the injured king was attended to by the royal doctors and the priests of Sekhmet. As the doctors examined the wound, they realized that little could be done to save the king. Nevertheless, they did all they could in the circumstances and wrapped the king's leg in linen soaked in oil and honey to hold the leg in place and stop the bleeding. Despite their best efforts, the king's leg became infected, and within a matter of days, the 19-year-old King Tutankhamun was dead after just 9 years on the throne. There would be no long and prosperous reign, and the Egyptian kingdom was in turmoil once again. With the death of her husband, Ankhesenamun appears to have been the remaining survivor among Akhenaten's children, and ruled as regent in the absence of an obvious successor. While it would have been possible for her to follow in her mother's footsteps and rule in her own right, the court decided she should marry a man who would become pharaoh. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty were accustomed to marrying their own family members, but there were no close relatives left. As Ankhesenamun insisted on marrying a man of royal status, she took the surprising decision of sending a message to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma the Pharaoh, explaining the situation in Egypt and asking if he could offer a solution in the form of a son who would marry her and become pharaoh in place of her late husband. When Suppiluliuma received the letter 2 weeks later, he could hardly believe what he was being offered. He had been fighting the Egyptians in the Levant for decades, and now he had an opportunity to incorporate Egypt into his empire in an instant. Nevertheless, he remained cautious and decided to send an envoy to Egypt to find out if the offer was genuine, or if Tutankhamun was alive and well, and the whole scheme had been an elaborate Egyptian ruse to cripple Hittite power. Ankhesenamun was not pleased to learn that the Hittite king had not immediately accepted her offer, as she was in something of a race against time. Traditionally, a pharaoh would be buried 70 days after dying, but the late king could not be buried without a successor in place. Without carrying out the necessary rituals for his burial, Tutankhamun's passage to his eternal afterlife would be blocked. With winter approaching, there was no chance that Ankhesenamun would get an answer from the Hittite king within 70 days. Nevertheless, the royal artisans hurried to prepare the items for Tutankhamun's tomb that would help his journey into the afterlife. Egyptian kings typically had their grave goods made far in advance, but Tutankhamun had reigned for only 9 years and died unexpectedly when still very young. For most of his reign, artists and sculptors had been busy restoring the temples of the old gods, rather than producing his funerary goods. No matter how fast they worked, the royal artisans could not be expected to make an entire assemblage of grave goods for Tutankhamun within a mere 70 days, but they could repurpose those prepared for Neferneferuaten, which for some reason remained unused. The most spectacular object among these items was a golden death mask, which the late king's goldsmiths changed to bear his likeness while replacing the name Neferneferuaten with Tutankhamun. In addition to the items intended for Neferneferuaten, the artisans selected hundreds if not thousands, of items either owned by the late king or kept in the palace storerooms. Also intended for burial in Tutankhamun's tomb were the mummified remains of his two stillborn daughters in tiny coffins. Although work had started on a tomb for Tutankhamun, it was by no means ready. As Maya and other officials inspected the Valley of the Kings near Thebes for an alternative tomb, they decided to use the one being prepared for the late king's chief advisor and distant relative. The undecorated tomb was not yet suitable for Tutankhamun, and the craftsmen were ordered to excavate a new chamber that would become the king's burial chamber, together with a small room beyond it known as the treasury. The two existing rooms in the tomb would later be known as the antechamber and the annex. After excavating the burial chamber, the royal craftsmen painted the walls, transferring existing designs from papyrus prepared during the Amarna period. In accordance with the traditions of his time, Tutankhamun had a mortuary temple built for him in the Theban necropolis, where priests would make offerings to keep his spirit alive in the afterlife. The late king's body was taken nearby to be embalmed, preserving his body as a vessel into which his soul could return to rest. His brain and internal organs were removed, including his heart, which was typically left inside the body. Traditionally, the internal organs would have been placed in canopic jars, but Tutankhamun's were placed in a chest, divided into 4 compartments protected by the goddesses Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Serket. The king's body was covered with natron, a salt used in the mummification process to dry out the body and stop it from decaying. After 40 days, the natron was removed, and the body was wrapped in linen bandages, interspersed with amulets and other pieces of jewelry, while 2 daggers were placed on his body. The king's hands were crossed in front of his body, holding his crook and flail. On Tutankhamun's head, the embalmers placed Akhenaten's skullcap and the royal diadem between layers of bandages, all covered by the golden death mask, the final and most spectacular item on the mummy. Early the next year, the Hittite envoy was able to return to Suppiluliuma's capital of Hattusa in what is now central Turkey, alongside an Egyptian envoy bearing a letter from Ankhesenamun. The queen was outraged that the Hittite king had not believed her and repeated her offer once again. Suppiluliuma continued to have his suspicions, but was persuaded by both his own envoy and the Egyptian messenger that the offer from the Egyptian queen was genuine. He duly dispatched his 4th son, Prince Zananza, to travel to Egypt to marry Queen Ankhesenamun and become the new pharaoh. When Zananza died en route to Egypt in unclear circumstances, his father accused the Egyptians of murdering him. Upon the death of her prospective husband, Ankhesenamun decided she had no choice other than to marry the elderly her granduncle, who became the new king. In his correspondence with his Hittite counterpart, King acknowledged that Zananza was dead, but denied any wrongdoing. Suppiluliuma responded by launching an invasion of Egyptian territories in the Levant, only for the captured Egyptian prisoners to bring the plague, which had been troubling Egypt for many years, to Hattusa, a disease outbreak that killed the Hittite king. With in place as Tutankhamun's successor, the late king's funeral was scheduled for the end of March, 7 months after his death, much later than was typical. On the north wall of the burial chamber, the artists hurriedly painted the figure of performing the opening of the mouth ritual on his predecessor's body, a ceremonial act symbolizing rebirth in the afterlife. This ceremony was typically led by the crown prince, strengthening A's tenuous claims to Tutankhamun's throne. There was no time to build a wall separating the burial chamber from the antechamber, so only 3 walls were decorated for the time being. The scenes from Tutankhamun's burial ritual had already been painted on the walls of his burial chamber before the ceremony had taken place. The king's mummified body was presented with food and drink before being placed on a sled and dragged across the sands up the slopes of the Valley of the Kings into the tomb that had been prepared for him. Before the body entered the tomb, performed the opening of the mouth ceremony by gently touching Tutankhamun's lips with an adze, allowing him to speak in the afterlife. With his mummy carried by priests, the late king entered the darkness of his tomb and was placed into 3 nested coffins inside a red sarcophagus. The innermost coffin was made of solid gold, while the outer two were made of wood and decorated with glass and jewels. After the lids were placed on each of the 3 nested coffins, they were sealed with resin, but the heavy granite lid of the sarcophagus cracked and had to be repaired. The workmen then discovered the lid could not close properly, as the feet of the outer coffin were too tall and had to be filed down before the sarcophagus could be sealed tight. The workers then put together the wooden panels forming the 4 shrines that covered the king's body, but in their haste, they assembled the shrine the wrong way around, swapping east and west and north and south. In the meantime, Tutankhamun's canopic chest was placed in a shrine on the east wall of the treasury, with a box containing the remains of Tutankhamun's stillborn daughters placed nearby. At the entrance to the treasury, a shrine containing items used in the king's mummification was guarded by a jackal representing the god Anubis, the god of funerary rites. After the funeral, the artisans built the 4th wall of the burial chamber, decorating it with a scene of Tutankhamun in the afterlife in the traditional artistic style. After their work was done, the entrance to the tomb was blocked, covered with plaster, and stamped with official seals. Several months later than anticipated, Tutankhamun could begin his journey to the afterlife, where he would be engaged in a daily cosmic battle alongside the gods against the forces of evil that threatened to disrupt the earthly world. Yet the late king's continued existence in the afterlife could only be guaranteed if the priests at his mortuary temple continued to utter his name, and if his tomb and body were to remain undisturbed. After King A assumed the throne, Tutankhamun's prospects for an eternal afterlife seemed bleak. Although he had married Ankhesenamun to legitimize his authority as pharaoh, I quickly elevated his existing wife, Tay, as his great royal wife. Ankhesenamun was not featured in any of his royal inscriptions and disappears from the historical record. As far as Tutankhamun's spirit was concerned, worse was to follow when his tomb was broken into twice within the space of the year. The thieves may have been artisans who had worked on the tomb and knew the layout, and they carried out various small precious items that could not be traced back to the tomb. While the authorities made some attempt to tidy up the ransacked tomb, not everything returned to its original place, and the tomb was simply resealed. Within a year of Tutankhamun's burial, a heavy rainstorm broke out over the Valley of the Kings and deposited a meter of rubble over the entrance of the tomb, ensuring that the tomb of Tutankhamun would remain undisturbed for over 3,000 years. After reigning for around 4 years, the elderly King I died. His designated successor, General Nachtmin, who may have been his son, died shortly before him. Since Ankhesenamun was either already dead or, in any case, out of the picture, the succession was claimed by Horemheb, the highest-ranking courtier. As Tutankhamun had been buried in A's intended tomb, A chose to take over the tomb in the western Valley of the Kings, originally intended for Tutankhamun, but not finished before his death. Unlike A, Horemheb had no royal blood whatsoever, though his great royal wife Mutnejmet may have been I's daughter. While he continued his military campaigns against the Nubians and the Hittites, the new king considered it his primary duty to restore political order at home. While Horemheb continued Tutankhamun and A's work to restore the old religion, he decided to erase the memory of his immediate predecessors, replacing their names on temples and monuments with his own. By doing so, he not only consigned their names to oblivion in the mortal world, but extinguished their spirits in the afterlife. Not only did Horemheb order the desecration of A's tomb and the possible destruction of his mummy, he also usurped his predecessor's mortuary temple. He took credit for Tutankhamun and I's construction projects at the temples of Luxor and Karnak. All over the country, Horemheb replaced Tutankhamun's imagery with his own. He would undoubtedly have done the same thing to Tutankhamun's tomb, but it was more difficult to access after being buried under rubble. As Horemheb had no surviving children of his own, he named as his successor a senior official named Ramesses II. After a reign of around 14 years, Horemheb died, and his successor assumed the throne as Ramesses I, the founder of a new 19th dynasty. The second and third pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, Seti I and Ramesses II, the latter of whom is more widely known as Ramesses the Great, were warrior kings who helped to restore much of the prestige lost in the aftermath of the Amarna period. Horemheb's efforts to erase the memory of this period had been so successful that, over time, memory of King Tutankhamun faded away. In the mid-12th century BC, around 200 years after Tutankhamun's burial, the men working on the tomb of Ramesses VI built their huts directly above the rubble that covered the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb. Over the course of the following 3 millennia, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Saladin, and Napoleon Bonaparte all conquered Egypt without ever hearing of the existence of the pharaoh named Tutankhamun. It seemed that memory of his reign had been almost entirely lost to history. When Napoleon Bonaparte led his expedition to Egypt in 1798, he was accompanied not only by his officers and men, but also by a large team of scientists to study the artistic legacy of the ancient Egyptians. Egyptian artifacts, including the Rosetta Stone, were brought back to Europe for further examination. In the 1820s, Jean-François Champollion successfully deciphered the hieroglyphic script of the ancient Egyptians using the Rosetta Stone. This initiated the modern study of ancient Egypt, or Egyptology as it is known. Over the course of the 19th century, Egypt fell under the influence of British and French officials. The European interest in Egypt was partly economic, motivated by a desire to link the Mediterranean and Red Sea by the Suez Canal, but interest in Egyptian heritage also played a part. Although officially part of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt was effectively ruled by the British from 1882 onwards. Wealthy aristocrats and businessmen from Europe and the United States flocked to Egypt and applied to the Egyptian Antiquities Service for permits to carry out excavations. These wealthy individuals financed the archaeological digs and hired Egyptologists to carry out the work, laying claim to a share of the finds. By the end of the 19th century, archaeological activity was underway at sites throughout Egypt that would have been familiar to Tutankhamun, his father's capital of Akhetaten, the ancient capital Memphis, the monumental religious buildings. In Thebes, the mortuary temples and tombs of the Theban necropolis, and most importantly, the Valley of the Kings. The concession to dig in the Valley of the Kings was considered the most prestigious among the archaeologists working in Egypt, who all aspired to be the first to discover an intact royal tomb, as most of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings had been plundered by grave robbers, either in antiquity or in more recent times. Between 1905 and 1914, the concession was held by American businessman Theodore Davis. In February 1905, the intact tomb of Yuya and Thuya, the parents of Queen Tiye, and accordingly, the great-grandparents of Tutankhamun, had been discovered intact by James Quibble, a British Egyptologist sponsored by Davis. By this point, Tutankhamun's name was known to the archaeologists working in Egypt as his name appeared on the inscriptions of tombs of officials. But otherwise, his life and reign remained a mystery. Over the course of a decade, Davis had financed the discovery of more than 10 further tombs in the Valley of the Kings, including a small chamber containing gold foil depicting a king on a chariot bearing the names of Tutankhamun, Ankhesenamun, and Ai, which Davis identified as the tomb of Tutankhamun. By 1914, Davis gave up his concession and declared that the entire valley had been exhausted. Between 1905 and 1908, Davis had been assisted by Howard Carter, a British archaeologist who had previously worked as an inspector for the Antiquities Service before his resignation in the summer of 1905, several months after an incident involving Egyptian guards and French tourists caused him to be reassigned. By 1909, following the recommendation of Gaston Maspero, the director of the Antiquities Service, Carter began his collaboration with George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who began to visit Egypt every year to help his recovery from a car accident. When Davis gave up his concession for the Valley of the Kings, Carter and Carnarvon believed that there were more discoveries to be made in the area and successfully obtained permission to dig. The outbreak of the First World War disrupted their plans as Carnarvon was unable to travel to Egypt, while Carter worked in Cairo as an intelligence officer and did not have the time to carry out any new excavations. Yet, in his spare time, Carter continued to examine the map of the Valley of the Kings and focused on the Central Valley, the region where the tombs of Horemheb and the reburied Amarna royals had been discovered by Davis. He was not convinced that Tutankhamun's tomb had already been found and theorized that the king's tomb still awaited discovery. By 1917, Carter was able to begin work to test his theories, but after 5 years of excavating, nothing of real significance had been found, certainly not any intact royal tomb. By 1922, Lord Carnarvon had lost hope and informed Carter that he was withdrawing his sponsorship. The archaeologist urged his patron to give him one last chance, pointing to the group of workmen's huts near the tomb of Ramesses VI, which had not been cleared to the bedrock. Carter was even prepared to finance an extra season of digging himself, so long as Carnarvon authorized him to carry out the work under his permit. Impressed by Carter's determination, he agreed to sponsor one final season of work. On the 1st of November 1922, Carter's team began to remove the workmen's huts. On the 4th of November, the team stumbled upon a single step before uncovering a doorway leading to a sealed tomb. Although the tomb did not look like a royal tomb and he could not make out a name, he excitedly sent word to Carnarvon announcing the discovery of a tomb with its seal intact. Carter reburied the steps until Carnarvon's arrival on the 24th of November. The steps and doorway were uncovered to reveal the name of King Tutankhamun. As the excavation continued, Carter could not yet be certain that it was a tomb and not a cache of funerary goods from different kings, and he was disappointed to see signs that the tomb had been broken into before it was resealed. By the 26th of November, the entrance corridor had been cleared. Accompanied by Carnarvon and his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carter poked a hole into the antechamber and asked for a candle. As he peered inside, he saw a glittering collection of golden treasures and could hardly believe his eyes. Carnarvon broke the silence and asked Carter if he could see anything, to which the archaeologist replied, "Yes, wonderful things." The following day, accompanied by an Egyptian official, Carter and Carnarvon became the first people to step inside Tutankhamun's tomb for well over 3,000 years. Carter and Carnarvon found signs that the burial chamber had been broken into, and in order to reassure themselves that the burial was still intact, they are alleged to have broken through the same opening before resealing it. An official opening of the tomb was then held on the 29th of November. The discovery was reported in the Times of London the following morning. As the man who discovered an intact royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, Carter knew he had a great responsibility. He installed a steel gate at the tomb's entrance to bolster security, and he decided to document each item from the tomb in its original location and after it had been taken for examination. In this work, he was assisted by the chemist Alfred Lucas and the photographer Harry Burton, while a nearby tomb was commandeered to serve as a laboratory for the conservation and documentation of the artifacts. By the 16th of February 1923, the antechamber had been emptied of its contents and work could begin on the burial chamber. A number of factors hindered the work on Tutankhamun's tomb, including the attention of the world's press and the arrival of thousands of tourists and dignitaries keen to catch a glimpse of the golden treasures Carter had uncovered. Work was further delayed by the death of Lord Carnarvon after a mosquito bite on his face became infected. Lady Carnarvon was allowed to keep her late husband's permit, but work stopped amidst disputes between the Egyptian government and the Carnarvon estate over the distribution of the finds from the tomb. When the press claimed that Carnarvon had succumbed to an ancient curse, an irritated Carter insisted that the tomb was safe and no such curse existed. It wasn't until September 1925 that work began to remove the pharaoh's body from his coffins. After the lids of the first two coffins were removed, the golden innermost coffin was revealed in all its splendor. As the two inner coffins were stuck together by the resin used to seal the coffins, they were brought to the antechamber, where the lid of the golden coffin could be opened, revealing the mummy with the famous gold death mask on its head. Since the mummy itself was stuck to the golden coffin, Carter's workmen carried the two coffins into the laboratory. Unable to separate the mummy from the coffin, Carter decided to unwrap Tutankhamun inside his coffins, an operation carried out by the anatomist Douglas Derry and an Egyptian assistant. as layer after layer of the linen bandages were removed. The amulets and jewelry were collected for further analysis. By the time the king's corpse was revealed, it was found to be in very poor condition. In order to remove all the items found on the king's body, Carter's team had to dismember the body, until the decapitated head remained still covered by the golden mask. Derry eventually separated the mask from the head with heated knives, revealing the face of the king whom he had just cut to pieces. It was not until 1932 that conservation work was finally completed on the tomb, but Carter's discovery had elevated the status of a relatively minor pharaoh, one who was forgotten for 3 millennia, to become the most widely known of all Egyptian rulers. A replica of the tomb's antechamber was made for the British Empire exhibition at Wembley Park in 1924 and 1925, while shops in London were full of merchandise bearing images of artifacts from the tomb, most notably the golden mask, which was first exhibited to the public in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo in January 1926. Carter reassembled Tutankhamun's body and returned it to the outermost coffin and the sarcophagus in the burial chamber. Carter died in March 1939, shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War. It is believed that during the war, the tomb was broken into and the body disturbed, and a team of researchers in 1968 found that the body was no longer in the position Carter had described when he returned it to the tomb. In January 2005, Tutankhamun was taken out of his tomb for CT scanning. In November 2007, Tutankhamun's body was moved into the antechamber for better preservation in a climate-controlled case. Pending the discovery of any new royal tombs, he is the only Egyptian pharaoh to be resting in his own tomb. In recent decades, researchers have used the data collected from Tutankhamun's body to draw conclusions about his life and death. The theory that he had clubfoot is supported by what appear to be numerous walking sticks found in his tomb, but it is possible that his remains were damaged either during the embalming process or by Carter's team, and that these sticks were actually used as symbols of royal authority rather than to help the king walk. Similarly, there are competing theories about the cause of his death. DNA testing suggests that he suffered from malaria, while a dislodged piece of his skull has fueled the belief that he was murdered, challenging the idea that his death was due to a hunting accident. The absence of Tutankhamun's heart and damage to his ribcage points to a traumatic wound to the chest, though this may have been the result of damage to the mummy which occurred during the break-in during the Second World War. Although Tutankhamun's body remained in Egypt, the artifacts from his tomb have been exhibited abroad on several occasions, beginning in 1961 with a tour of North America accompanied by a campaign to raise awareness for the conservation of archaeological sites impacted by the construction of the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the treasures traveled to Europe, including London, Paris, and throughout the Soviet Union. Since the 1980s, Tutankhamun's famous gold mask has remained in Egypt, where it is expected to stay forever. But other items from the tomb have been exhibited internationally since 2004 until the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. The whole collection of artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb, over 5,000 objects in total, is being prepared for display at the Grand Egyptian Museum, newly built near the Pyramids of Giza. Over a century after Howard Carter's discovery of his tomb, the story of Tutankhamun's life is still being re-evaluated. New technology and scientific methods may uncover mysteries surrounding the brief life and reign of the pharaoh whose successors attempted to erase him from history. Likewise, there are many details about Tutankhamun's family members from the Amarna period that remain unknown, and the young pharaoh's parentage even remains a matter of debate. Thus, King Tutankhamun, despite being the most famous of all Egyptian pharaohs, whose death mask has become a symbol of ancient Egypt, remains something of a mysterious figure. He grew up in Akhenaten's court at Amarna, where he witnessed the establishment of the cult of Aten, the memory of which was later obliterated by his successors. After spending the first decade of his life accompanied by religious upheaval and political disorder, Tutankhamun came to the throne and began the process of restoring the old gods and disestablishing the cult of Aten, abandoning Amarna for the traditional political and religious centers of Memphis and Thebes. After his death at a very young age, his legacy as the man who began to restore the old religion was usurped by his advisors and successors, Horemheb in particular, who sought to erase Tutankhamun from history. For more than 3,000 years, thereafter, Tutankhamun remained unknown and undisturbed until Howard Carter's discovery of his tomb elevated him to a degree of international fame that easily eclipsed the significance of his own brief reign. What do you think of Tutankhamun? Was he the tragic boy king who spent most of his short reign controlled by his courtiers? Or should he be recognized as an important historical figure in his own right, responsible for restoring a degree of political and religious order after the upheavals of Akhenaten's reign? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.